If you were a Tudor citizen hoping to catch a solid, uninterrupted 8 hours, I have bad news. The concept simply didn't exist. That's because the Tudors didn't invent their sleeping customs. They inherited them from their medieval ancestors, who themselves hadn't exactly cracked the code to a peaceful night. Think of it like inheriting an old family recipe, except the recipe is for mild nightly suffering, served cold. One of the most curious aspects was the idea of 2 sleeps. On modern times, we expect to crawl into bed, sink into unconsciousness, and wake up when our alarm decides to ruin everything. In Tudor England, however, the night was often split into 2 distinct chunks. People would have their first sleep, wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or more, and then have their second sleep. This wasn't seen as insomnia, it was just how life worked. The in-between time was called the watch, and during this period people might pray, read by candlelight, tend to animals, or for the especially sociable, wander over to a neighbor's house for a chat. Yes, midnight social calls were a thing, which sounds quaint until you realize there was no coffee to recover from it the next day. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic why a good night's sleep was impossible in Tudor England, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. This whole pattern had roots in medieval agricultural life. The medieval world ran on daylight and necessity. Without artificial light, aside from a candle or a smoky oil lamp, darkness was a signal to rest. But darkness also came early in winter, and nobody could realistically sleep for 12 straight hours without waking up at some point. So people treated the middle of the night as bonus time to get small chores done. And the Tudors, never a people to reject a tradition that made them moderately more productive, simply kept the practice going. The result? Tudor nightlife often meant gossip in your nightshirt, while someone stirred a fire in the background. Now, even if you wanted privacy for your sleep, forget it. The concept of a bedroom, a private, solitary room for sleeping, was for the wealthy elite. For everyone else, beds were a communal affair. Families slept in the same room, and it wasn't unusual for guests, servants, and sometimes total strangers to share a mattress or sleeping space. The logic was partly about warmth. Body heat was a free resource, but it was also about the sheer shortage of beds. Beds were expensive to make and expensive to own. For the average Tudor villager, the idea of having a personal bed was as far-fetched as having a personal carriage or a personal ship. And if you think that sharing a bed sounds intimate, remember this wasn't the kind of cozy couple sleeping arrangement you see in movies. It was closer to an 1800s train car, but horizontal. A line of bodies all trying to keep their own space, some rolling over in their sleep and elbowing you in the ribs. It could be your spouse, your younger brother, or an unfamiliar traveler whose only contribution to the night was snoring like he was auditioning for a hog-calling contest. Speaking of travelers, inns at the time were infamous for their stranger bedfellows policy. If you were traveling and booked a bed at an inn, there was a good chance you'd be sharing that bed with someone who had booked earlier or later. You might go to sleep alone and wake up next to a wool merchant from Norwich who smelled strongly of sheep and old ale. In this system, the phrase "sleep tight" could easily have meant "don't let your blanket be stolen in the night." Beds themselves were often seen as status symbols. Among the wealthy, the bed wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was the most valuable item in the house. Nobles and rich merchants would show off their beds like modern people show off sports cars. These were massive, ornate constructions with carved headboards, embroidered hangings, and sometimes even a canopy to showcase wealth. For poorer households, though, a bed might simply be a wooden platform in the corner, or even a shared sleeping mat on the floor. Some didn't have a bed at all, just a cleared space where people would sleep on straw. The lack of personal space also meant that the rhythms of the household dictated when you could actually fall asleep. You couldn't just decide to go to bed when you were tired. If you lived in a home with multiple people in one room, you'd be at the mercy of someone's late-night conversation, a crying child, or a neighbor singing a song to help himself fall asleep, loudly and off-key, and there was no such thing as telling people to be quiet for your sake. If anything, you were the rude one for suggesting it. All of this means that the Tudor idea of a good night's sleep wasn't based on comfort, it was based on survival. Did you get through the night without being kicked by your bedmate, woken by your neighbor's prayers, or drafted into midnight cheese-making during the watch? Congratulations, you slept well. The truth is, Tudor sleeping customs weren't designed for rest. They were designed for practicality, warmth, productivity, and economy. Rest was just a pleasant byproduct if it happened at all. Which brings us to perhaps the most important rule of Tudor sleep. You didn't go to bed for peace and quiet. You went to bed because that's where the rest of the humans in the house already were. The good news, you're not sleeping in a ditch. The bad news, you're probably sharing your bed with a guy named Roger who snores like a dying goat. If you're picturing a romantic Tudor bed frame straight out of a period drama, a massive sturdy four-poster with a velvet canopy, you're only getting half the story. The reality is that Tudor bed frames ranged from opulent fortress for sleeping to wobbly wooden accident waiting to happen. Your frame's quality depended entirely on your wealth, your carpenter's skills, and, in many cases, whether the bed had already survived 3 generations of hard use. Let's start with the basics. Wood. Tudor beds were almost always made from oak, a sturdy, heavy timber that could last decades or centuries if it wasn't devoured by worms, warped by damp, or chewed by the family goat. Yes, livestock sometimes wandered inside. Wealthier homes might boast ornately carved oak frames, covered in intricate patterns, family crests, and biblical scenes. In fact, for the nobility, the bed frame itself could be as much a display of wealth as the bedding on top of it. The craftsmanship was often so elaborate that the frame was passed down as an heirloom, sometimes specifically mentioned in wills. Owning one was like having the Tudor equivalent of a luxury car, except this car didn't move, squeaked all night, and occasionally collapsed. For the less wealthy, however, bed frames were much simpler affairs and far more prone to indignity. Poorer households often had frames made from softer, cheaper woods, roughly nailed together, and without the kind of precise joinery that kept a bed from groaning ominously every time someone shifted their weight. These frames didn't just creak, they had personalities. They popped, they bent, and sometimes with the right unlucky turn they gave way entirely. A sudden collapse wasn't just a slapstick comedy moment. It could actually injure you if you hit the floor hard enough. And remember, there was no calling customer service for a replacement. You simply hammered the thing back together and hoped it wouldn't betray you again. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Tudor bed construction was the rope system. Instead of a modern slatted base or metal springs, the mattress was supported by thick ropes woven across the frame in a crisscross pattern. These ropes would sag over time, so they needed to be tightened regularly. How? By literally turning a wooden key or peg, sometimes called a bed wrench, to pull the ropes taut again. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. In other words, sleep tight wasn't a sweet wish for peaceful dreams. It was a practical reminder to make sure your bed's suspension system wouldn't drop you into the floorboards at 2 a.m. Of course, this rope setup had a few flaws. If one rope snapped, the whole structure could lose tension, creating a lopsided sleeping surface that pitched you toward the nearest bedmate. If enough ropes loosened, you ended up sleeping in a hammock shape whether you wanted to or not, and the tightening process could be noisy, wooden pegs squeaking, ropes groaning, meaning your bed's maintenance ritual was not exactly discreet. Then there were bed curtains, a feature we often romanticize today, imagining them as part of some intimate candlelit Tudor scene. In reality, these curtains were about as romantic as a tax audit. Their main function was insulation, to block out the relentless cold air that seeped into houses with poor or no insulation. They also helped with privacy in shared rooms and acted as a barrier against the occasional rat or mouse scampering across the rafters. In wealthier homes, these curtains could be made of rich fabrics like damask or heavy wool, embroidered with elaborate patterns. In poorer households, they were often coarse wool or linen, thick enough to block drafts but thin enough to let in a suspicious amount of cold anyway. Curtains could also serve as a visual statement. Imagine walking into a great hall and seeing the Lord's bed tucked into an alcove, its massive carved posts draped with deep crimson hangings. It was like saying, yes, I am rich enough to own a small tent indoors, and I sleep in it. In smaller homes, though, bed curtains could double as makeshift storage space. You could hide baskets, shoes, or last week's laundry underneath or behind them, because no guest was bold enough to peek behind someone's bed hangings. For portable or temporary beds, think servants traveling with their masters, or soldiers on campaign. The frame could be more of a collapsible cot-style structure, with the same rope lattice system, but without the grand four-post design. These were lighter, but they were also notoriously flimsy. One bad shift in weight and the whole thing tilted, spilling the unfortunate sleeper onto the floor. That's why the most cautious Tudors treated unfamiliar beds with suspicion, giving them a gentle shake before climbing in, just to make sure they were structurally committed to surviving the night. One overlooked aspect of the Tudor bed frame was its height. Beds in wealthier households were often surprisingly tall, sometimes requiring a small stool to climb in. This wasn't just for show. A higher bed kept you farther from the cold air pooling at floor level, and from any unwanted critters wandering around. Poorer beds were much closer to the ground, sometimes so low they barely qualified as frames at all, which meant you got the full benefit of floor drafts and the occasional uninvited animal visitor. The truth is, a Tudor bed frame could be many things: a status symbol, a piece of practical furniture, a makeshift fortress against drafts, or a wooden death trap waiting for the right moment to humiliate you. It creaked, it sagged, and it needed constant rope tightening just to stay functional. And while the wealthy might have slept under grand canopies with fine curtains, most people were simply hoping the whole thing wouldn't collapse before dawn. If your Tudor bed didn't collapse, it just serenaded you with squeaks until morning. If you think of a mattress today, you probably imagine something designed to cradle your spine, promote healthy posture, and gently lull you into a deep, restorative slumber. In Tudor England, however, a mattress was less engineered for comfort and more a bag full of whatever softish material was lying around. It didn't so much invite you to relax as dare you to try. For the average Tudor, the standard sleeping surface was the palliasse, a large sack, usually made from coarse linen or hemp cloth, stuffed with straw or hay. And when I say straw, I don't mean some idyllic golden wheat stalks freshly bundled from the fields. No, this was whatever was cheapest and most available: dry grass, chaff, the dusty husks from threshed grain, reeds, or in coastal areas even dried seaweed. The smell of a palliasse could range from pleasantly earthy to "are you sure something hasn't died in there?" depending on how recently the stuffing had been changed, which for many households was not often. A fresh palliasse wasn't terrible, in the way that sitting on a fresh bale of hay isn't terrible. It had some spring, a bit of give, and the faint aroma of the countryside. But straw breaks down quickly. After a few weeks of nightly use, it would flatten into uneven patches, the stalks snapping into stiff, pokey fragments that jabbed at you in your sleep. Eventually, the whole thing became a lumpy, compacted mat that absorbed dampness like a sponge and refused to let it go. And given England's famously humid climate, refused to let it go meant you could be lying on a mattress that felt permanently cool and slightly clammy, which might have been nice in summer but in winter felt like sleeping on a refrigerated loaf of bread. If you had money, however, you could invest in a feather bed, the Tudor equivalent of a luxury mattress. But don't get too excited. The phrase feather bed sounds better than it often was. Yes, it could be gloriously soft if it was properly made, regularly fluffed and stuffed with fine down from geese or ducks. But high-quality down was expensive, so many so-called feather beds were bulked out with coarser feathers, wool clippings, rags, or even shredded fabric scraps. If you've ever plopped down on a cheap pillow and immediately been stabbed by a quill, congratulations, you've had a small taste of the Tudor featherbed experience. Another problem with feather beds was maintenance. They required regular shaking and turning to prevent the filling from clumping into dense, uneven lumps. Neglect this core for too long, and your bed could develop distinct hills and valleys that funneled you toward the middle whether you wanted to be there or not. This was awkward if you shared the bed with someone you'd rather keep at a polite distance. There was also the smell factor. Feathers, especially if they weren't perfectly clean, had an aroma. Mix that with the ambient smells of a Tudor bedroom, which we will politely not list here, and your bed might emit a scent best described as farmyard deluxe. For those in between rich and poor, wool-stuffed mattresses were another option. Wool retained heat beautifully, which was great for winter, but it was also heavy, hard to dry if it got damp, and prone to compressing into solid slabs over time. A neglected wool mattress could eventually feel less like a bed and more like sleeping on a felted doormat. No matter the material, Tudor mattresses had one universal truth: they were rarely washed. You couldn't just unzip the cover and throw it into a machine. Laundering a mattress meant completely emptying it of its stuffing, washing the outer shell if you could, and then replacing or refluffing the contents. Most people simply added more stuffing on top of the old material as it flattened, creating sedimentary layers of bedding history. A mattress could easily contain years' worth of accumulated debris: broken straw, lint, feathers, hair, and whatever else happened to fall between the sheets. And of course we can't ignore the other life forms that called Tudor mattresses home, without mentioning fleas or bedbugs yet. Those deserve their own chapter. Let's just say that any warm, padded, rarely cleaned sack was bound to become a cozy ecosystem for creatures you did not invite. These mattresses were less memory foam and more memory farm. Some Tudor households did get creative with mattress stuffing. In coastal regions, dried seaweed was sometimes used as a filler. It was cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly springy. The downside: on damp days, the salty smell could be overwhelming, giving you the sense that you were sleeping in a fishing boat. In areas with access to reeds or moss, those materials were also pressed into service. Moss, when dried, made a soft and even surface, but had an unfortunate tendency to crumble into dust over time, coating everything in a fine greenish film. If you were especially poor or transient, you might not have had a mattress at all. Instead, you'd make do with a heap of straw directly on the floor, maybe with a blanket over it. This was called a shakedown because you literally shook the straw out onto the floor at night and piled it back up in the morning. It was cheap, quick, and about as comfortable as you're imagining. Ultimately, Tudor mattresses were not built for plush, cloud-like comfort. They were utilitarian sacks whose primary function was to keep you off the hard wooden frame or the cold floor. A few hours of rest was the goal. Spinal alignment was not even in the conversation. Whether you were lying on lumpy straw, pokey feathers, or a dense slab of wool, the experience was more about endurance than luxury. A Tudor mattress didn't cradle you in comfort. It reminded you that life is suffering. If you think your occasional mosquito encounter is bad, imagine lying down in your Tudor bed knowing it was already occupied, not by a partner, not by a pet cat, but by an entire thriving ecosystem of things that wanted to drink your blood. And no, this wasn't an oops, we forgot to vacuum situation. This was a permanent part of Tudor sleeping life. The problem started with the fact that Tudor beds and bedding were rarely, if ever, fully cleaned. Washing sheets was a laborious process involving hauling water, heating it, making lye soap, scrubbing by hand, and then drying without the benefit of a sunny laundry line if it was winter. That meant most people just didn't bother. You might air your bedding out the window, beat it with a stick to shake out the worst of the filth, or sprinkle dried herbs to mask the smell. But actually getting rid of pests? Forget it. They had squatters' rights. Bedbugs were perhaps the most infamous offenders. These flat, reddish-brown insects made their homes in wooden bed frames, in the seams of mattresses, and between layers of straw stuffing. They were tiny, stealthy, and experts at hiding during the day. But come nightfall, they emerged like a Tudor horror story, crawling over sleepers to feed. And while modern bedbugs cause mostly itching and irritation, in the Tudor period they had an extra punch. They could help spread infections, especially when scratching bites broke the skin. Then there were fleas, which didn't even have the decency to stay put in bed. Fleas hitched rides on humans, dogs, cats, livestock, and even the straw used in mattresses. Once inside the home, they didn't care whether you were rich or poor. They'd happily bite anyone. Fleas were more than an annoyance. They were disease vectors. It's not hard to see how illnesses like the plague could rip through entire towns when fleas treated every human like an all-you-can-eat buffet. In a crowded Tudor household, one flea infestation could mean everyone, from the master of the house to the lowliest servant, was scratching away together. Lace were another persistent issue, especially body lice and head lice. These insects laid eggs in hair or in the seams of clothing and bedding. When entire families, sometimes servants too, slept in the same bed to conserve heat, lice had the perfect environment to multiply. They thrived in unwashed hair, on unlaundered pillows, and in the creases of wool blankets. In fact, Tudor doctors were well aware that lice carried fevers and other illnesses, but since hygiene wasn't widely understood as preventative medicine, curing lice often involved remedies like rubbing vinegar into the scalp or wearing special caps overnight, which, unsurprisingly, rarely worked. And let's not forget the larger, less subtle creatures. Mice and rats were not strangers to Tudor bedrooms, with food storage being primitive and crumbs falling into bedding or onto floors. Rodents had a reason to visit. Bed curtains, that heavy fabric draped around the sleeping area, did provide some protection, but they weren't perfect. If you were unlucky, you might wake to the unsettling sound of tiny claws on the bed frame, or the feeling of something furry scampering across your legs. For the wealthiest Tudors, pests were still a reality. Even in palaces, bedbugs and fleas infested the grandest of four-posters. Nobles might sleep on embroidered sheets and under velvet canopies, but those luxurious fabrics were also perfect hiding spots for insects. The difference was that the rich could occasionally afford professional help, fumigators who would burn herbs like rosemary, wormwood, or pennyroyal beneath the bed to smoke the pests out. Of course, that came with its own risks. A poorly supervised bed fumigation session could easily set the entire bed or bedroom on fire. To combat pests, Tudors relied heavily on herbal deterrents. Lavender was stuffed into mattresses or sewn into pillowcases to discourage bugs. Sprigs of mint, rue, and tansy were laid between sheets, partly for the scent and partly in the hope that insects hated it enough to leave. Some people even scattered ash or sand in bedding seams to scratch up the bugs' shells. These tricks might have slowed infestations, but they never truly eliminated them. Children's beds were arguably the worst. They often inherited mattresses or blankets from older siblings, which were already well populated with generations of pests. And because children were considered less delicate than adults, their bedding was changed even less frequently. The psychological toll of sleeping in a pest-ridden bed must have been considerable. Imagine drifting off knowing you'd wake with itchy welts, or seeing your blanket shift ever so slightly when something small moved beneath it. And with no concept of germ theory, most people didn't understand the full danger. They just knew that they were itchy, uncomfortable, and often ill. Still, this was everyday life. People accepted their nighttime cohabitants as inevitable, just part of what it meant to be alive in the 16th century. Complaining about bedbugs was like complaining about the weather, unpleasant, but not something anyone could really change. The good news, your bed wasn't lonely. The bad news, it wasn't lonely because you were sharing it with hundreds of tiny freeloaders who didn't pay rent, stole your blood, and occasionally gave you the plague. Or, as one might put it in Tudor terms, every Tudor bed came with a free pet. Unfortunately, that pet was bloodthirsty and impossible to evict. The Tudor era wasn't just an age of ruffled collars, tactful intrigue, and dangerously spiced meat pies. It was also quite literally freezing. Historians refer to this period as part of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long stretch from roughly the 14th to the 19th century when winters in Europe were far colder than today. And while that might sound charming if you picture snow-dusted villages and mulled ale by a roaring fire, for most people it meant one thing: you were going to bed in conditions more suitable for smoked fish than living humans. First, the climate. The winters of Tudor England could be bitterly harsh. with extended frosts that sometimes lasted for months. Rivers like the Thames would freeze solid enough for people to hold frost fairs, bustling markets right there on the ice. Picturesque? Absolutely. Fun to attend? Sure, if you enjoyed standing around until your toes stopped existing. But once you left the frozen festival and went home, your bed wasn't a refuge from the cold. It was an extension of it. Tudor homes were not known for their insulation. In fact, most were about as airtight as a colander. Poor families lived in timber-framed houses with wattle and daub walls, essentially mud smeared over a wooden skeleton. These offered some shelter from the wind, but in the depths of winter, drafts would whistle through the cracks like an impatient ghost. Wealthier homes, built of stone, were sturdier, but even colder. Stone holds the chill like a grudge. Unless you were sleeping next to the kitchen hearth, which was prime real estate, your room would drop to outdoor temperatures the moment the fire died down. There are Tudor accounts of water freezing indoors overnight, not just in buckets but in drinking jugs set beside the bed. Imagine waking up, reaching for a sip, and finding you'd just grabbed a chunk of medieval ice. It's little wonder that a bed was less about comfort and more about survival. To keep warm, people layered up aggressively before sleep. Forget the dainty single-layer nightshirt from period dramas. In real life, you might wear several garments to bed, including your daytime woolens. Blankets were piled high, though blanket in Tudor terms could mean anything from rough wool to a patched-together quilt stuffed with scraps. The poor often didn't have much in the way of bedding at all. A single rough coverlet might have to suffice for the whole family. Speaking of the whole family, one of the most effective heat retention strategies was simply sharing body warmth. This meant multiple people, sometimes unrelated, crammed into the same bed. The practice was common in inns, where travelers might find themselves spooning with total strangers just to make it through the night without frostbite. In the countryside, children often shared beds with siblings, and in some cases parents, grandparents, or anyone else who needed a warm spot. For the wealthy, bed curtains were the secret weapon. These heavy fabric drapes surrounded the bed on all sides, creating a mini microclimate. Once drawn, they trapped body heat and blocked the worst of the drafts. A rich Tudor bed was often a grand carved four-poster, but the real luxury wasn't the woodwork. It was the chance to actually sleep without your breath crystallizing in mid-air. Even so, cold-related discomfort was universal. Fires were expensive to keep burning all night, and most Tudors relied on embers that would slowly die out as they slept. Once the fire went, so did the illusion of warmth. You could pile on more blankets, but there's a limit before you feel like you're being flattened by a woolly tombstone. Cold also brought health hazards. Prolonged exposure to low indoor temperatures could worsen respiratory illnesses, which were already a major killer. The dampness that came with winter chill seeped into walls, bedding, and clothes, creating an environment ripe for lung infections. If you were poor, there was no escape. You simply endured until spring. For some, the solution was to keep moving. In the depths of winter, people might wake in the night to stoke the embers, pace around, or even climb into bed with the livestock. Yes, you read that correctly. In smaller rural homes, it wasn't unusual for animals and humans to share living space, partly for convenience, partly for warmth. A cow in the next room was like having a very large, very smelly radiator. In short, bedtime during the Tudor period was not the serene, candlelit affair you might imagine. It was a nightly battle against the elements. You wrapped yourself in every scrap of warmth you owned, curled up like a hedgehog, and prayed you wouldn't wake up as a frozen Tudor popsicle. The good news? Spring eventually came. The bad news? By then your mattress was probably damp, your blankets full of pests, and you still had to get through next winter. You didn't so much sleep as slowly turn into a people-shaped icicle. The Tudor bed was designed with one season in mind, winter. The problem was that the rest of the calendar also existed, and when summer arrived it turned your sleeping arrangements into something between a slow bake and a mild torture. While the Tudors feared the cold with a bone-deep vengeance, their solutions to keeping warm, heavy feather mattresses, fur blankets, and curtains that trapped heat became an unbearable prison when the temperature finally climbed. To understand the misery, you have to picture a Tudor summer night. First, there was no airflow in the modern sense. Tudor houses had small, often shuttered windows because glass was rare and expensive. Most people had nothing more than wooden panels or oiled cloth to cover the openings. On a hot night, you'd fling these open for relief and immediately regret it. An open window was an open invitation, not only to fresh air, but to mosquitoes, moths, rats, and any opportunistic thief with quiet shoes. If you were unlucky enough to live near the Thames or a stagnant pond, mosquitoes arrived in dense clouds, ready to ensure you got neither cool air nor uninterrupted sleep. Even without the insect invasion, the bedding itself was the enemy. Tudor bed covers weren't seasonal. The same thick wool blankets and fur throws that kept you alive in January now wrapped you in a heat-trapping cocoon. Removing them wasn't always an option. Your only sheet was often attached to the mattress, or you feared leaving yourself uncovered due to vermin, drafts, or superstition. Yes, some believed night air could make you sick, which meant they'd rather sweat than risk a so-called deathly chill. And then there was the smell. Poor hygiene was the default, not the exception. People did not bathe daily or even weekly. Water was viewed with suspicion. Bathing was considered a luxury, and the most many could manage was a quick wash of the face and hands. Add a few days of Tudor summer heat, and the combination of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and stale air created a pungent cloud that lingered in the bedchamber. You didn't just sweat in a Tudor bed, you marinated. If you were wealthy, you might own a four-poster bed with thick curtains around it. In winter, these trapped warmth beautifully. In summer, they trapped everything else. Body heat, breath, and the aforementioned aroma, turning your sleeping space into a personal sauna. The rich had the advantage of larger rooms, but even in a palace, a closed bed curtain could make you feel like you were sleeping inside an oven lined with sheep. The poor, ironically, sometimes fared better, sleeping on a thin straw mattress on the floor in a drafty cottage, at least offered the chance of a stray breeze. But even here, heat brought its own problems. Crowded sleeping arrangements, siblings, parents, and sometimes farmhands all packed into the same room meant every additional body raised the temperature and added to the collective scent. Then there was the psychological element. In an age without artificial light, bedtime began earlier. The longer summer days meant you might try to sleep before the sun had even fully set, your room still holding the day's trapped heat. And with the only nighttime entertainment being conversation or lying quietly in the dark, you had hours to stew, literally and figuratively, in your own discomfort. Occasionally, desperate Tudors tried to sleep outdoors, but this came with its own hazards: dew-soaked blankets, prowling animals, and neighbors with sticky fingers. Even the rich rarely risked it, preferring the swelter to the scandal of being found half-dressed in the garden. The rare solutions to summer sleeping were almost comical in their inadequacy. You might remove a blanket, or sleep in your shift instead of a nightgown. Some tried spreading reeds or rushes on the bed to absorb sweat, though these had to be replaced before they rotted. Others swore by sleeping with their feet uncovered, a small act of rebellion that offered fleeting coolness before the rest of their body demanded equal treatment. And let's not forget, there was no cold drink to help you through the night. Water was avoided for fear of illness, and ale or small beer served at room temperature offered little refreshment. You'd wake in the night parched and hot, only to gulp down something that had all the cooling effect of warm soup. In short, a hot Tudor night was a lesson in endurance. You lay there, sweat trickling, the air thick, the bedding heavy, and the room full of the gentle hum of mosquitoes planning their midnight feast. You prayed for a breeze, but more often than not, all you got was the slow creeping awareness that morning was hours away. The modern luxury of flipping on a fan, switching to light sheets, or even cranking up the AC would have seemed like sorcery. For the Tudors, summer was just something you endured, one stifling, sticky, sleepless night at a time. Or as one might put it, imagine being trapped under 5 layers of bedding in July, marinating like a Tudor meat pie, and knowing tomorrow night would be exactly the same. If you've ever complained about a faint whiff of gym socks in your modern bedroom, Congratulations, you'd be considered the height of olfactory luxury in Tudor England. In the 16th century, the concept of fresh air was more of a rare guest than a permanent resident. Tudor bedrooms were a symphony of smells, and not the good kind. It wasn't just one bad odor, it was a layered, ongoing performance of stink, each source adding its own note to the overall composition. The most obvious culprit? The chamber pot. Since indoor plumbing was still a distant dream, every respectable and not-so-respectable household kept a ceramic or metal vessel tucked discreetly in a corner of the bedroom. These weren't emptied every time someone used them. Not when it was freezing outside, not when it was raining, and definitely not when you were too sleepy to care. Instead, they were often left overnight to stew, perfuming the air with a bouquet that can only be described as fermented regret. If the fleas didn't wake you, the chamber pot certainly would. Then there was the bedding, and here's where things get truly medieval. Washing sheets regularly simply didn't happen, partly because laundering heavy linen was backbreaking work, and partly because people didn't see the need. Sheets might be washed a few times a year if you were lucky. That meant months of sweat, body oils, and the general grime of living in an era when daily baths were rarer than a king who stayed married. On a hot night, that baked-in funk intensified, rising like some sort of Tudor ghost that refused to be exorcised. The very construction of the bed didn't help either. Mattresses were typically stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers, all of which absorbed smells over time. If the straw wasn't changed regularly, and it often wasn't, it could start to smell musty, damp, or even slightly rotten. Feathers and wool, meanwhile, trapped odors with a persistence that would put modern memory foam to shame. The result? You might as well have been sleeping inside a giant, slightly sweaty compost bin. But perhaps the most surprising contribution to Tudor bedroom air quality came from the very thing meant to keep you warm: the fire. In wealthier homes, the bedroom might have a small hearth, but Tudor chimneys were not the paragons of efficiency. Smoke often leaked into the room, leaving the air heavy and acrid. Even if you didn't have an indoor fire, the general smoke from cooking hearths, neighbors' chimneys, and the communal air pollution of a Tudor town meant that fresh air wasn't all that fresh to begin with. Imagine falling asleep to the gentle crackle of wood and waking up with a throat that felt like you'd swallowed half a charcoal briquette. And we haven't even touched on the human element. Personal hygiene in the Tudor period was, let's say, an evolving concept. People did wash, but full-body baths were rare, and scented soaps were expensive. A day's worth of farm labor, kitchen work, or simply existing in heavy woolen clothes in summer added its own aromatic contribution to the bedroom. Multiply that by however many people you were sharing the bed with. Remember, multiple sleepers per bed was common, and the olfactory math gets ugly fast. Add to all this the smell of damp. Tudor homes weren't sealed fortresses. They were porous, drafty structures where moisture crept in easily. Damp wood, wet thatch, and mildew could linger year-round, mingling with all the other scents until you no longer noticed them, or so you told yourself. A visitor might be bowled over by the smell, but for you, it was just home. Of course, the Tudors didn't think of their bedrooms as especially foul. This was simply the background scent of life. When every room in the house smelled vaguely of smoke, sweat, and chamber pot, the bedroom was no worse than anywhere else. But if you were to walk into one today, your nose would likely stage a protest before your brain even had time to process what you were smelling. In short, a Tudor bedroom was less a place of rest and more a fragrant reminder of the many, many ways pre-modern life could challenge your senses. And while the sounds of the era may have faded into history, the smells, well, be glad those didn't survive. If you've ever complained about noisy neighbors, allow me to transport you back to a Tudor bedroom. Forget double-glazed windows or white noise machines. Your lullaby would be a hearty mix of street brawls, livestock serenades, and the delicate pitter-patter of rats square dancing in the rafters. Silence wasn't just rare, it was practically mythical. The first culprit was architecture, or rather the lack of anything resembling soundproofing. Tudor houses were mostly timber frames stuffed with wattle and daub, a combination of mud, straw, and wishful thinking. Noise didn't just come through the walls, it came with them. Every creak of the house's wood seemed amplified, especially at night, when footsteps on the upper floors could sound like a small militia marching overhead, and those upper floors, they weren't far away. Tudor homes were built vertically to save space, so bedrooms were stacked above taverns, kitchens, or even stables. If you lived above a tavern, and many people did, your nightly soundtrack was clinking tankards, bawdy laughter, and occasionally the dramatic crash of someone discovering gravity after too much ale. If you didn't live above a tavern, don't get smug, you might live next to one. Sound travelled like gossip in Tudor England, fast, unfiltered, and impossible to stop. Glass windows, the kind that might muffle a bit of street noise, were a luxury. Most homes had either wooden shutters or oiled cloth coverings that barely kept out the wind, let alone sound. In summer, you'd fling them open to try and catch a breeze, only to invite in every noise within shouting distance, which in a Tudor town could be quite a lot. Roosters crowing at dawn were the least of your worries. Geese honking, pigs squealing, and dogs barking in the middle of the night were just part of the package. Then there were the vendors. The street market didn't politely wait for morning. Sellers might start shouting about fresh bread, fish, or eels before the sun had fully risen. And they didn't just call out their goods, they bellowed them like carnival barkers who had something to prove. Imagine trying to get your beauty sleep with someone outside yelling, "Hout pie! Get your hot pie" at full volume. Even in the countryside, peace was far from guaranteed. Barn animals had their own nighttime habits, and they weren't subtle about them. Cows mooed, sheep bleated, and horses occasionally stomped or neighed in the middle of the night. And let's not forget the foxes, owls, and other wildlife who didn't care about your sleeping schedule. Inside the house, things weren't much better. Families often slept several to a bed, and multiple beds to a room. This meant you were just as likely to be woken by your uncle's snoring, your brother's midnight mumbling, or the baby wailing for milk as you were by anything outside. Beds were often made of ropes and straw mattresses that groaned with every movement, so shifting your position was basically a declaration of war on everyone's rest. And then the rats. Tudor towns were crawling with them, and if you didn't hear them scratching in the walls or scampering overhead, it was only because you'd gone temporarily deaf from the tavern next door. They gnawed, they chittered, and occasionally they knocked something over in the attic with enough force to make you wonder if they'd started furniture rearranging as a side hustle. Night watchmen also contributed to the racket. While their job was to patrol the streets for safety, they did so while loudly announcing the time and proclaiming that all was well, an ironic statement if you were lying awake, listening to the chorus of chaos. Their lanterns and staffs clacked against the cobblestones, sometimes accompanied by the distant sounds of someone being escorted to the stocks for public humiliation the next morning. If you were unlucky enough to live in a busier part of town, drunken brawls could break out at any hour. A misunderstanding over dice or spilled ale could escalate into a full-on street performance, complete with shouting, shoving, and the occasional smashing of property. Children, dogs, and chickens scattered in every direction, and the noise rolled right into your open window like an uninvited guest. So what did Tudor sleepers do to cope? Well, there was no earplug industry to save them. Some tried wrapping their heads in cloth to muffle the noise, but that also made it harder to breathe. Others relied on sheer exhaustion to knock them out. After all, if you were bone-tired from working dawn to dusk, you might just manage to sleep through a tavern fight. But for the rest, the only option was to lie there, eyes wide open, waiting for the chaos to die down. Your options were simple: listen to drunken singing outside, or hear every single rat in the rafters above. Either way, the Tudor lullaby was less sweet dreams and more urban survival training. If you thought the Tudor night was one long, uninterrupted snooze, think again. Sleep in the 16th century wasn't a single block of unconscious bliss. It was more like two poorly scheduled naps, separated by a mysterious intermission. Historians call it first sleep and second sleep, but to a Tudor, it was just life. You'd go to bed after dark, sleep for a few hours, then wake up, often for 1 to 2 hours before drifting off again until dawn. and that midnight wake-up could be peaceful, productive, or absolutely terrifying, depending on what was happening in and around your house. Imagine you've just fallen into your first sleep. You've pushed past the scratching of fleas, ignored the chamber pot aroma, and tuned out the sound of your neighbor's goat in the yard. You've even managed to stay warm under a pile of blankets heavy enough to crush a small dog. But then, like clockwork, you wake up around midnight. No alarm clock, no rooster, no Tudor iPhone buzzing. Your body simply knows it's time to get up. This was as natural to them as brushing your teeth is to us. Well, if brushing your teeth was something you actually did daily in the Tudor era, spoiler, you didn't. That middle-of-the-night period wasn't wasted. People prayed, read devotional texts if they were literate, or whispered bedtime gossip to their bedmates. Some might stoke the fire, check the embers, or add logs because letting the fire go out in winter meant waking up in a room cold enough to freeze your candle stub. Farmers might slip on their boots and head outside to check the livestock, ensuring no fox had made off with a chicken or a wolf with a sheep. Others, especially in towns, might listen for suspicious noises. Theft was a genuine concern, and it's easier to guard your home if you're already up half the night. If you heard footsteps outside, you had to quickly decide whether it was your drunken cousin staggering home or a burglar casing your door. The former might be let in for more ale. The latter might be greeted with a well-aimed chamber pot contents dump from the window. While romanticized highwaymen are a later invention, Tudor England still had its fair share of low-level criminals happy to relieve you of your hard-earned goods. These weren't the dashing rogues of fiction. They were usually just desperate men and sometimes women looking for food, clothes, or anything that could be pawned. A dark, unlit street was their best friend, and most homes had only a simple wooden latch to keep intruders out. It's no wonder people treated the midnight waking period as a prime time to be vigilant. Of course, not all threats were flesh and blood. To the Tudor mind, the hours after midnight belonged to forces far stranger and more dangerous. Witches, ghosts, demons. These weren't campfire stories, they were accepted realities. The witching hour was thought to be a time when dark forces roamed freely, and an unexplained knock, groan, or gust of wind might send shivers down even the bravest spine. Candles would be lit, prayers muttered, charms clutched. Some people sprinkled salt at their thresholds to ward off evil. Others made the sign of the cross before stepping outside, just in case something invisible was lurking. The devil, according to many sermons, was not above popping into your home while you slept, and everyone knew someone whose cousin's friend saw a spirit in their pantry. That eerie, wakeful period was also prime time for storytelling. Families and housemates would sometimes use the dark, flickering firelight to tell tales, often the kind that made you sleep with one eye open. Spirits of wronged lovers, headless monks, phantom animals, and mysterious lights in the woods all made the rounds. In a world without Netflix, this was how you entertained yourself, though the side effect was convincing yourself that every creak of the rafters was a skeletal monk climbing into your attic. In the countryside, the midnight wake-up was less about ghosts and more about goats. Cows, pigs, and sheep didn't keep human hours, and farmers sometimes had to deal with noisy disruptions. A cow calving, a fox raiding the henhouse, or a horse deciding to kick the stable door repeatedly because it wanted attention. The Tudor farmer's night was often divided between the bed and the barn. Once you'd prayed, patrolled, or panicked about phantoms, you would crawl back into bed for your second sleep. This phase was deeper and often more restful, partly because exhaustion finally caught up with you, and partly because the coldest, darkest part of the night had passed. If you were lucky, you'd wake at dawn with the sound of birds, though more likely it was the neighbor's rooster screeching like it was possessed. It's hard to sleep deeply when half your neighbors believe Satan might be in your pantry. The first thing you noticed upon waking in Tudor England was that you were, unfortunately, still alive to face another day. Survival was good in theory, but it came with its own brand of aches, itches, and indignities. There was no stretch, yawn, and sip your coffee while scrolling through your phone moment. The Tudor morning was more of a slow, cranky climb out of whatever makeshift bedding you'd been wrestling with all night. If you were lucky enough to sleep in an actual bed, And by bed, we mean a wooden frame with ropes crisscrossed under a lumpy mattress. You would still wake up feeling like you had been in a wrestling match with an invisible bear. The ropes sagged in the middle, forcing you into a hammock-like curve that did wonders for your spinal misalignment. Tudor joints were not pampered by memory foam. They were forged in the daily battle between stiff straw, worn rags, and the occasional nail or splinter poking through the mattress ticking. Rising from this contraption required a strategic roll and push motion, a kind of medieval yoga move, and the occasional assistance from another person if your knees were in full rebellion. The next sensation to greet you, itchiness. Fleas, lice and bedbugs had spent the night dining on you with the kind of persistence that modern pests can only dream about. These weren't shy, occasional bites. These were raised welts, red streaks and a maddening urge to scratch yourself raw. And the worst part? You weren't just itchy from your own bed. These critters happily hitched rides between households, spreading like a six-legged social network. Your spouse, your children, your neighbor's children, everyone was in on the party. There was no true escape except for sheer endurance and the occasional delousing, which was about as pleasant as it sounds. As you tried to shake off the bites, you'd notice it was still cold, because of course it was. The fire in the hearth had died down to a pile of sullen embers during the night, and the air was a damp, biting chill that clung to your skin. Warming yourself meant either getting the fire going again, which involved bending over, coughing through smoke, and possibly arguing with whoever was supposed to keep the embers alive, or simply deciding to endure the cold until movement thawed you out. Blankets were not plush, oversized and cozy. They were rough, heavy and often smelled faintly of damp wool and smoke. And if you thought you could skip straight to a hearty breakfast to lift your spirits, think again. The Tudor morning meal, if you got one, was usually simple bread, maybe a bit of cheese, and possibly ale or small beer to wash it down. Not because Tudors were alcoholics, although the tavern numbers might make you suspicious, but because water wasn't always the safest option. A stale loaf and weak beer wasn't exactly the burst of energy you needed after a long, fractured night, but it was better than nothing. On top of that, the chores began immediately. Livestock needed feeding, water had to be fetched, and whatever trade or work you were involved in didn't wait for you to feel fully functional. Tudor mornings were a race against daylight, and you couldn't afford to waste the precious hours when the sun was up. It didn't matter if you still felt like a half-frozen, bug-bitten corpse. The chickens wouldn't feed themselves and the fields wouldn't plough themselves. And for some, there was the awkwardness of explaining why you hadn't slept much. Maybe the tavern noise had kept you up. Maybe your bedmate had been thrashing around like they were reenacting a medieval battle. Or maybe, as often happened in small, crowded homes, someone else had been up and about in the night and you'd overheard more than you wanted. In communities where everyone lived on top of each other, literally privacy was a fantasy. You went to bed knowing you'd hear every cough, every creak, and if you were unlucky, every argument or romantic encounter happening a few feet away. So by the time you finally emerged from your house into the muddy street, you weren't bright-eyed or ready to greet the day with enthusiasm. You were simply awake enough to keep moving. In fact, waking up refreshed was such a foreign concept that it probably would have sounded suspicious to a Tudor. A sign that you'd been doing something unnatural. No, the more realistic outcome was waking up slightly angrier at existence, muttering at the sky and hoping the day ahead didn't bring any new reasons to hate life. And for the average Tudor, that was considered a perfectly normal, even successful start to the day. Imagine walking into Florence in the year 1500. The streets smell faintly of fresh bread, unwashed humanity, and the metallic tang of someone hammering a church bell in the distance. Towering cathedrals loom overhead, their facades dressed in marble and their insides stuffed with paintings, frescoes and sculptures, all competing to be the most jaw-dropping thing you've ever seen. The city isn't just beautiful, it's a showroom, and every brushstroke, every carved curl of marble, every halo above a saint's head has one purpose: to shout, "We're rich, we're powerful, and God probably loves us best." This is the Renaissance, that golden age of art and culture that historians love to swoon over. But for the artists living in it, It was less golden and more hope your spine can take it. To be an artist here was to enter a world where your talent could make you famous, but only if you could survive the politics, please impossible clients, and churn out beauty faster than a baker churning out bread. Art wasn't just decoration, it was currency, propaganda, and occasionally a very expensive form of spiritual insurance. Florence, Rome, and Venice were the beating hearts of this cultural explosion. Florence was where banking money met artistic ambition. The Medici family practically threw gold at painters and sculptors, not because they were feeling generous, but because art was the Instagram feed of its day. You wanted to show the world you had taste, wealth, and influence? Commission a fresco the size of a barn wall. Bonus points if the Virgin Mary happened to look suspiciously like your wife. Rome, on the other hand, was where the Catholic Church flexed its artistic muscles. Popes competed with each other not just over theology, but over who could hire the most famous artist and decorate the biggest chapel. St. Peter's Basilica wasn't just a church, it was a spiritual megaphone, a towering statement that screamed, "Welcome to God's house." Please admire the ceiling Michelangelo nearly died painting. Venice, glittering on its canals, loved art in a different way. Its wealthy merchants weren't so much into biblical epics as they were into lush portraits, dreamy landscapes, and sensual mythological scenes that were technically classical, but also just happened to feature an awful lot of very naked people. Subtlety was not a Venetian virtue. In this climate, an artist was both a craftsman and a celebrity in training. But make no mistake, in the early 1400s, being an artist didn't mean you were strolling around in a beret contemplating your genius. It meant you were part of the guild system, a tightly controlled network of trades. Painters belonged to the Guild of St. Luke, alongside apothecaries who provided pigments. Sculptors? They were in the Stoneworkers Guild, which meant their art was officially classified somewhere between building a cathedral and repairing a staircase. So yes, art was serious business, but also very literal business. You didn't just paint for art's sake, you painted because someone was paying you to fill a wall, a chapel, or a palace ceiling, and that someone had very specific ideas about what you should be doing. Sometimes those ideas were visionary, sometimes they were more like, make the angel look friendlier, my aunt says he's scowling. For a lucky few, this was the path to glory. Names like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo echo down the centuries because they managed to balance impossible deadlines, picky clients, and their own towering ambition. But for every superstar, there were dozens of hard-working, talented artists whose names we've forgotten, not because their work was bad, but because they didn't have the right patrons or the right luck. History, it turns out, is a ruthless art critic, and here's where the glittering part meets the miserable part. You could become famous, yes, but you could also spend your life painting altarpieces in drafty churches, freezing in winter, sweating in summer, and working under candlelight that was one bad gust of wind away from setting your hair on fire. Even the most successful artists dealt with endless revisions, grueling hours, and the occasional political upheaval that sent all their patrons running for cover. Because remember, the Renaissance was also a time of constant instability. Wars broke out, rulers were overthrown, the Pope might suddenly decide you were out, and your rival was in. A commission you'd been promised could vanish overnight. One day you were painting for the Medici, the next the Medici were exiled, and your mural was being whitewashed by the new regime. If art was the currency of power, artists were often the coins being tossed around. Yet for all this there was an undeniable thrill to being part of it. You weren't just painting, you were helping to define an age. Every brushstroke added to a city's identity. Every sculpture became part of its public memory. Whether you were chiseling marble in Florence, layering oils in Venice, or frescoing a chapel in Rome, you were in the middle of something extraordinary. Of course, extraordinary doesn't always mean comfortable. The Renaissance was a golden age for art. But unless you were sitting on the patron's side of the table, it was also an age of aching backs, stiff necks, and hands permanently stained with pigments. The good news? Your work might be remembered for centuries. The bad news? So will the smell of that glue you've been boiling all week. So welcome to the Renaissance, a dazzling era of beauty, brilliance, and ambition, as long as you didn't mind living with the constant risk of running out of paint, patience, or patrons. So you're 13 years old in Renaissance Italy, and your parents have decided you have potential, not the kind that gets you into politics or the clergy. That would require you to own more than 2 shirts without paint stains, but the kind that might earn a living through art. Congratulations. You've just been signed up for one of the most grueling, underpaid, and sleep-deprived career tracks in the known world, becoming an artist's apprentice. Forget the romantic notion of learning at the feet of a master. Apprenticeship in the 15th and 16th centuries was less about divine inspiration and more about sweeping, scrubbing, and running errands. A master painter's workshop wasn't a quiet, candlelit studio where genius floated in the air like perfume. It was a bustling production line, and you were the unpaid intern at the bottom of the hierarchy. The first thing you learned as an apprentice wasn't how to paint, but how to endure. The day started at dawn, and before you even thought about touching a brush, there were floors to sweep, firewood to chop, and water to haul. Pigments didn't just magically appear in jars. You were the one grinding minerals into powder, mixing them with oil or egg yolk, and straining them through cloth until your arms went numb. One of the most coveted and most miserable jobs was preparing ultramarine, the deep blue pigment made from lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan. This stuff was worth more than gold, and it didn't exactly come in user-friendly tubes. You spent hours grinding the stone into the finest dust imaginable, your hands turning permanently blue in the process. The upside: you looked like you were wearing fancy gloves. The downside: they were permanent, and they didn't smell great. And pigment preparation was just the beginning. Need some glue for gold leaf? You'd be boiling animal bones and skins until the whole workshop smelled like something had died. Which, to be fair, it had. Varnish. That required heating linseed oil until it was ready to ignite, preferably without actually burning down the building. You weren't learning art so much as alchemy with a high risk of personal injury. The hierarchy in the workshop was clear. The master was at the top. His senior assistants were the middle management, and you, the new apprentice, were somewhere below the workshop's cat in terms of status. For years, your brush time was limited to filling in large, unimportant areas, skies, backgrounds, maybe a saint's robes if you'd proven yourself. The delicate details, faces, hands, and anything involving gold were strictly off limits. If you got too ambitious and touched the master's work without permission, you'd be back to sweeping floors faster than you could say patron's deadline. Of course, the apprenticeship wasn't just manual labor, you were also there to learn by observing. This meant watching your master sketch compositions, experiment with perspective, and deal with the endless stream of wealthy patrons who wandered in to check on progress. These visits were valuable lessons in diplomacy. If the Duke of wherever thought the angel's halo needed more sparkle, you didn't argue, you smiled, nodded, and hoped he wouldn't ask you to repaint it himself. Apprenticeship was also your introduction to the fine art of copying. Masters expected their apprentices to replicate existing works again and again until they could match every curve, shadow, and brushstroke. Originality was not the goal, consistency was. You might dream of creating your own masterpiece, but for now you were the human equivalent of a photocopier. The living arrangements were part of the deal too. Apprentices often lived in the master's household, which meant free room and board, in exchange for being on call at all hours. You were family, in the same way a medieval farmhand was family, fed enough to work, scolded when you messed up, and occasionally yelled at in front of guests. Privacy was non-existent, and your bed might be a straw mattress in the corner of the workshop, with the lingering scent of turpentine as your lullaby. The contract. Yes, there was a formal contract. Typically bound you to your master for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. During that time you were forbidden from taking outside work, selling your own art, or doing anything that might compete with the workshop's business. In exchange, your master was supposed to train you in the full range of skills: drawing, painting, anatomy, perspective, sculpture, and maybe even architecture if you were lucky. Whether you got that well-rounded education depended entirely on your master's mood, workload, and personal generosity. But there was one undeniable benefit. You were in the room where it happened. You saw commissions from start to finish, from the first rough sketch to the final flourish of gilding. You learned how to stretch canvas, carve wooden panels, and prepare plaster for frescoes before it dried into an unworkable wall of regret. You absorbed the secrets of the trade, not just the technical skills, but the survival strategies. You learned how to flatter a patron, how to improvise when supplies ran out, and how to make the same batch of paint last twice as long without anyone noticing. And eventually, if you proved yourself reliable, talented, and not prone to setting things on fire, you might earn a promotion to assistant. That meant more creative work, a little more pay, and the tantalizing possibility that one day you might open your own workshop. Of course, by that point you'd also inherited your master's back problems, paint-stained clothing, and deep mistrust of anyone who said, "It's just a small commission." In the end, apprenticeship was a test of patience as much as talent. You weren't just learning to be an artist, you were learning to endure years of drudgery for the faint hope that one day someone would pay you to tell some poor apprentice to grind your lapis lazuli. If you were a Renaissance artist, your career didn't hinge on inspiration so much as it hinged on one thing: getting someone rich and powerful to like you enough to pay you. And by pay, I mean commission you for a project so big and so complicated that it would take you years, possibly the rest of your natural life, to finish. Enter the patrons, those glittering names who shaped the art of the Renaissance as much as the artists themselves. They were the Medicis of Florence, the popes of Rome, the dukes of Urbino, the Doges of Venice. These weren't just clients. They were the Renaissance equivalent of producers, campaign managers, and reality show judges all rolled into one. And much like producers, they had a knack for smiling sweetly while utterly rewriting your vision. For the wealthy elite, commissioning art wasn't just about beauty, it was about broadcasting power. A vast fresco in your private chapel announced that you were both devout and obscenely rich. A marble statue in your courtyard told visitors that you had taste, money, and probably some unpaid stone carvers somewhere. Art was tactful PR, and the more jaw-dropping the better. Take the Medicis, for example. This Florentine banking dynasty practically cornered the art market, commissioning works that plastered their name, symbols, and even family portraits into religious scenes. Nothing says humility before God quite like sneaking your own face into the adoration of the Magi. And if you thought you could paint Mary without the exact shade of blue the patron's grandmother liked, think again. The popes naturally took this game to divine levels. In Rome, the papal court was an art world juggernaut. Popes like Julius II didn't just want chapels painted, they wanted every inch covered in grandeur. He's the one who famously dragged Michelangelo away from sculpting to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Julius didn't care that Michelangelo insisted he was a sculptor, not a painter. When your client wears the papal tiara, "I don't do ceilings" isn't an option. The problem with patrons wasn't just that they had demands, it was that they had very specific demands. They might hand you a commission for an altarpiece and then proceed to dictate every single detail. The saints should be arranged in a precise order. The Virgin Mary should be wearing ultramarine because it's expensive and shows they can afford it. That angel over there, make him look friendlier. No, friendlier. No, now he looks smug. Start over. This micromanagement could border on the absurd. Patrons might change their minds halfway through the project, demanding new figures, new colors, or an entirely new subject. Imagine spending months painting a biblical scene only to have your client decide they'd rather have a mythological one instead. The word revision in the Renaissance didn't mean tweaking a detail. It meant scraping off a saint's face and repainting it from scratch. And then there was the political layer. Every brushstroke could be loaded with meaning. Including the wrong figure, or excluding the right one, could land you in the middle of a feud you didn't even know existed. Florence, Venice, and Rome were tactful minefields, and artists had to tread carefully. If your patron fell out of favor, your beautiful fresco might suddenly be declared heretical or outdated and painted over by the next regime's favorite artist. But perhaps the trickiest part was timing. Patrons had a frustrating habit of wanting their art yesterday. It didn't matter that you were working with oil paint that took weeks to dry or marble that required months of chiseling. The Duke wanted it done before the next feast day, and if that meant you skipped sleeping, so be it. Artists became masters of working under pressure, often with apprentices laboring round the clock to meet impossible deadlines. And let's not forget payment. Renaissance patrons were notorious for paying late, paying less than promised, or paying in installments that stretched over years. Sometimes they'd offer payment in goods, wheat, wine, or livestock, instead of hard cash. That might sound quaint until you realize you can't exactly pay your landlord with a goat. Artists often found themselves chasing down payments with the same persistence they applied to their brushwork. Still, a good patron could make a career. Being associated with a powerful family or a respected religious institution gave you prestige and credibility. It meant your name would be known in other wealthy circles, and in a world where reputation was everything, one glowing endorsement from a high-ranking patron could open doors to bigger and more lucrative commissions. But there was always a balance to strike. You wanted to satisfy the client without completely losing your artistic soul. Some artists played the long game, slipping subtle personal touches into works that otherwise catered to their patrons' tastes. Others gave in entirely, treating art like a service industry. Tell me what you want and I'll make it happen, no questions asked. And of course there were those rare, daring moments when an artist pushed back. Michelangelo famously argued with Pope Julius II over the Sistine Chapel design, at one point leaving Rome in a fit of frustration. He came back, the papal payroll was persuasive, but most artists knew better than to argue too hard. After all, in the Renaissance, a wealthy patron didn't just hold the purse strings, they held the keys to your future. So if you were lucky enough to land a commission, you smiled, nodded, and took notes. You painted the Virgin's robe the exact color your patron's cousin's wife liked. You gave Adam's calves the perfect muscular curve. And when your patron beamed at the finished work, you knew you'd earned more than payment, you'd earned survival in the cutthroat beauty business of the Renaissance. For all the soaring cathedrals, shimmering frescoes, and marble Adonaises of the Renaissance, let's not pretend this was some kumbaya artist commune. Beneath the haloed saints and cherubic angels was a world of ego, jealousy, and pettiness that would make a modern reality show look like a knitting club. In Renaissance Italy, talent was your sword, reputation your shield, and gossip your weapon of choice. Artists weren't just competing for commissions, they were fighting for immortality. And when immortality is on the line, you don't just paint angels, you throw shade, sometimes quite literally over your rival's work. Take the most famous art world Cold War of them all, Michelangelo versus Leonardo da Vinci. Both were geniuses, both were temperamental, both thought the other was vastly overrated. Their feud wasn't the kind of subtle rivalry where each politely pretends to admire the other's work. Oh no, this was sniping in public rivalry. In Florence, the city fathers had the bright idea of commissioning both men to paint battle scenes in the same hall of the Palazzo Vecchio. The idea was to showcase Florence's glory. What they actually created was an unspoken battle of the brush. Neither painting was finished. Leonardo left after running into technical issues. Michelangelo left to go carve yet another giant piece of marble, but the point was made. Two titans couldn't share one wall without the air crackling with mutual disdain. Leonardo reportedly mocked Michelangelo's obsession with muscular male, hinting that perhaps the sculptor's knowledge of anatomy came from hanging around the wrong kind of places. Michelangelo, in turn, took every opportunity to jab at Leonardo's failures, particularly his tendency to abandon projects halfway through. If passive-aggressive sarcasm were an Olympic sport, these two would have tied for gold. And they weren't alone in their artistic combat. Over in Venice, Titian and Tintoretto were locked in a decades-long duel for dominance. Titian was the established master, beloved by patrons and respected across Europe. Tintoretto was the ambitious upstart, with a flair for speed and drama. Titian tried to block Tintoretto from joining the Painters Guild, fearing competition. Tintoretto responded in the most Tintoretto way possible, by showing up to a major commission for the Scuola di San Marco, and offering to do the work for free, on the condition that his piece be permanently installed. The patrons, sensing a bargain, agreed. Titian fumed. Tintoretto won. Of course, Rivalry wasn't always about stealing commissions. Sometimes it got more hands-on. There are stories, unconfirmed but delicious, of artists sabotaging each other's work. Imagine spending weeks preparing a delicate layer of plaster for a fresco, only to find that someone accidentally added too much sand to the mix, making it crumble, or discovering that your carefully mixed pigments had been tampered with, so your heavenly blue sky dried into a muddy swamp green. And then there was the weaponized rumor. In cities where reputation meant everything, planting doubts about a rival's skill, reliability, or moral character could be devastating. Whispers that an artist was lazy, wasteful, or worst of all, incapable of delivering on time could send patrons running to the competition. In some cases, the gossip was entirely fabricated. In others, it was a carefully exaggerated retelling of a very real disaster involving, say, a collapsing scaffold and an unfortunate priest. The Renaissance also had its fair share of theatrical rivalries. Quite literally, public unveilings of new works were opportunities for both admiration and critique. Picture a crowded church, the curtain dropping on a newly revealed altarpiece, and your rival standing at the back, loudly wondering if perhaps the perspective on that building in the background looked a little crooked. The crowd murmurs. You grit your teeth. Somewhere an apprentice is already rehearsing your rebuttal. And this wasn't just petty ego, there was serious money at stake. The most prestigious commissions often led to decades-long careers under the protection of powerful patrons. Losing a commission to a rival didn't just bruise your pride, it could mean the difference between steady work and spending the winter carving cheap devotional statues for the tourist trade. Yet, in an odd way, these rivalries often pushed artists to new heights. Michelangelo's need to outdo Leonardo arguably fueled some of his most ambitious work. Tintoretto's hustle to prove himself against Titian led to some of the most dynamic compositions in Venetian art. The competition was brutal, but it was also an engine of innovation, and occasionally there were moments of reluctant respect. Even Michelangelo had to admit that Leonardo could draw like no one else. Titian, despite his efforts to block Tintoretto, couldn't deny the younger painter's energy and imagination, but don't expect any warm, fuzzy reconciliations. This was still the Renaissance, where grudges aged like fine wine and were served just as cold. In the end, the Renaissance art world was as much about politics and personality as it was about paint and marble. Behind every serene Madonna or heroic David was a battlefield of ambition, rumor, and the occasional accidental sabotage. These artists may have been painting angels, but the real drama was happening on the ground in whispers, in glances, and in the relentless race to make sure your name, not your rivals, would be the one history remembered. If you've ever craned your neck to look at a particularly stubborn cobweb on your ceiling and thought, "Wow, my muscles are screaming already," congratulations, you have just experienced a fraction of what Renaissance ceiling painters endured. Forget the romanticized image of an artist serenely applying pigment while angels hum in the background. Ceiling work was an unforgiving blend of acrobatics, endurance, and slow-burn physical destruction. The crown jewel of this painful profession was, of course, Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Commissioned by Pope Julius II in 1508, it wasn't exactly a job Michelangelo wanted. In fact, he was a sculptor by preference, and reportedly grumbled that painting was beneath him. He even wrote a poem complaining about the misery of working overhead, his beard covered in paint drips, his back arched like a bow, his neck permanently kinked, and his face resembling a crusty old bread loaf from the constant upward tilt. This was not an exaggeration. Scaffolding didn't allow for the artist to lie on his back as many people assume. Instead, Michelangelo stood, leaning backward for 4 years. That's 4 years of battling gravity, paint fumes, and the slow realization that his chiropractor was several centuries away from existence. The scaffolding itself was a marvel of engineering, but not exactly ergonomic. Imagine a wooden platform hanging several stories up, swaying ever so slightly with each movement. One misplaced step, and it wasn't a bad day at work, it was your last day at work. And then there was the paint. Fresco, the technique used for large wall and ceiling works, required applying pigments to wet plaster, which meant the artist had to work fast before the surface dried. This added the charming stress of a ticking clock to an already nerve-shredding task. Then there's the paint drip problem. Working overhead meant that gravity was not your friend. Every flick of the brush risked a droplet landing in your eye, on your lips, or inside your nostrils. Fresco pigments weren't toxic in small doses, but they certainly weren't seasoning either. And since cleaning supplies were basically buckets of water and rags, your eye protection consisted of squinting aggressively and hoping for the best. Even the artistic challenges were magnified by the ceiling format. When painting a flat canvas, you can step back, admire your work, and make adjustments, but when you're painting 30 feet up, stepping back means potentially stepping into empty air. Artists had to rely on intuition, sketches, and muscle memory to get proportions right. That's why when you look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Adam's finger almost touching God's finger feels so perfect, because Michelangelo nailed it without being able to see the full composition in one glance. And while Michelangelo gets the most fame for ceiling painting agony, he was hardly alone. Artists across Italy were tackling domes, vaults, and chapel ceilings for wealthy patrons who loved the grandeur of looking up and seeing heaven. But heaven came with herniated discs. Giovanni Battista, Tiepolo, a master of airy, illusionistic ceilings in the 18th century, reportedly employed teams of assistants not just to speed the work, but to share the physical toll. The work required not only artistic skill, but stamina worthy of a professional athlete. You weren't just painting cherubs, you were doing a 4-year-long plank exercise. Of course, this back-breaking effort wasn't just for aesthetics. Ceiling paintings were often massive propaganda pieces. Churches wanted to inspire awe and remind the congregation of exactly who had the money to commission such wonders, while secular palaces wanted to impress visiting dignitaries with dizzying displays of wealth. The higher and more elaborate the ceiling, the more it screamed, "We can afford to make our artists suffer for our glory." By the time a ceiling project was finished, the artist had usually aged about a decade in body, if not in years. Chronic neck pain, inflamed shoulders, and eye strain were the unglamorous souvenirs of Renaissance glory. And yet, the result was often breathtaking, the kind of work that made even the most cynical patron gasp upon entering the room. For the artist, that gasp was the one moment of reward before collapsing into a chair, if they could still bend their knees enough to sit. So the next time you find yourself admiring a painted ceiling, whether it's the Sistine Chapel or a smaller parish church, spare a thought for the artist. Somewhere between the divine inspiration and the finished masterpiece was a very mortal human, aching from head to toe, with paint in their hair and plaster dust in their lungs, muttering to themselves, "I should have just painted a nice landscape." Because in Renaissance Italy, painting a ceiling didn't just lift the viewer's eyes toward heaven, it permanently tilted the artist's neck in the same direction. If you think the Renaissance was all elegance and silk doublets, think again. Behind every angelic fresco and marble masterpiece was a workshop that looked and smelled like a cross between a medieval chemistry lab and a building site during a dust storm. The tools of the trade weren't just difficult to use, they were actively trying to kill you. In fact, if you managed to finish a major artwork and still had your eyesight, most of your teeth, and a functioning liver, you deserved a medal. Let's start with pigments. Modern artists get to squeeze their colors out of tidy tubes. Renaissance painters, they had to grind their own, and many were about as safe as licking the inside of an alchemist's cauldron. Lead white was a favorite for making luminous flesh tones, but prolonged exposure could cause tremors, hallucinations, and ultimately death. Think of it as the Renaissance equivalent of working in a paint factory without a mask. Except the mask hadn't been invented yet, and your employer thought ventilation meant leaving the door open for the cat. Then there was vermilion, a rich glowing red made from mercury sulfide. It gave paintings the kind of regal pop that could impress dukes and kings, but it also slowly poisoned the artist. Handling it meant risking headaches, mood swings, and if you were particularly unlucky, losing control of your motor functions. Imagine painstakingly painting the perfect cherub's face, only for your hands to start shaking from the very substance that made it look so good, and for that deep oceanic blue that makes the Virgin Mary's robe pop in so many Renaissance masterpieces that came from ultramarine, made by grinding up lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. It wasn't toxic, but it was so expensive that using it recklessly could bankrupt you, or worse, cause your patron to question whether you were padding the invoice. If your pigment didn't kill you, your client's wrath might. Sculptors had their own dangers to contend with, starting with their beloved chisels. These tools were sharp enough to shape marble, and just as capable of shaping your fingers if you slipped. One moment you were carving the delicate folds of a toga, the next you were carving an unplanned gap into your knuckle. Michelangelo once described sculpting as freeing the figure from the stone, which sounds poetic until you realize it also freed quite a bit of blood from the artist. Then there was the stone dust. Marble dust filled the air of sculptors' workshops like an ever-present cloud, coating hair, clothes, and lungs alike. Breathing it in day after day could lead to chronic respiratory problems. Not that anyone had a name for them. You might think of it as the slow, gritty cousin of coal miner's lung, except there were no unions to demand safer working conditions. If you complained, your master might simply tell you to open a window, which, in winter, also gave you hypothermia. The painters didn't get off lightly with air quality either. They worked in rooms thick with the fumes of oil, turpentine, and varnish, all of which could cause headaches and dizziness. But the Renaissance wasn't big on safety warnings. If you fainted in the middle of painting the Pope's portrait, you were expected to just get back up and finish the job. And let's not forget the humble ladder and scaffolding, the silent killers of the art world. Whether you were frescoing a church wall or chiseling a saint onto a cathedral facade, you often worked several stories above the ground. Renaissance scaffolding was a masterpiece of questionable engineering, wooden planks balanced on poles with no guardrails, and often held together more by faith than by nails. One misstep, and you'd be meeting your subject matter face to face in the afterlife. Even the mixing process was risky. Pigments were ground with oil, egg yolk, or other binders, each of which came with its own hazards. Egg tempera might sound harmless until you remember there was no refrigeration, so a warm studio could mean you were essentially painting with salmonella. Oil paints were flammable, so one clumsy candle placement could mean the loss of your studio and your eyebrows. What's truly remarkable is that despite these hazards, Renaissance artists often lived long enough to produce multiple masterpieces. Perhaps it was sheer stubbornness, or maybe the constant near-death experiences kept them sharp. After all, when you know your cobalt blue might send you to an early grave, you're going to make damn sure it looks stunning on the canvas. In the end, the Renaissance workshop was a place where creativity and danger danced together daily. The chisels could slip, the scaffolding could wobble, and the pigments could slowly destroy your nervous system. But every stroke, every chip, every carefully mixed shade brought you closer to immortality. And for these artists, that was worth every cough, cut, and dizzy spell. Because as any Renaissance master might tell you, you can't make great art without suffering. But if you suffered too much, someone else got to sign the painting. If you picture a Renaissance artist in their studio, you might imagine a serene, candlelit space, the master standing alone at an easel, humming softly, delicately brushing color onto a masterpiece. Reality check. The average Renaissance studio was less like a sanctuary of genius and more like a frantic marketplace colliding with a construction site. Peaceful solitude? Not unless you count shouting over the noise of a grinding pigment mill as peaceful. A working studio was rarely just one person. At the center was the master artist, but orbiting around them were assistants, apprentices, journeymen, errand boys, pigment grinders, and occasionally the odd neighbor who had just popped in to stare. Apprenticeships often began young, sometimes as early as 10 years old, when a boy's and occasionally a girl's parents would ship them off to live with a master, essentially trading free labor for the hope their child would one day be able to sign their own work. These kids started at the bottom, and the bottom meant mixing pigments, stretching canvases, and cleaning brushes, all under the ever-watchful eye of a senior assistant who remembered exactly how miserable their own first year had been. In truth, the master's brush didn't touch every inch of a painting. That saint's halo, likely painted by an assistant, the ornate border, probably an apprentice. The master saved their personal touch for the most critical faces and details, the parts that clients would scrutinize to decide if the finished piece was worth the hefty sum they'd agreed to pay. This assembly line approach made sense when a single commission might require months of work, but it also meant studios could have multiple half-finished projects leaning against walls waiting for the master to swoop in and add the magic. And then there were the clients. In the Renaissance, people didn't just order a painting and wait politely for it to be delivered. No, they would drop by. Often, picture the horror of Michelangelo having some local nobleman stroll in mid-brushstroke to comment, that Virgin Mary's nose, could it be a little smaller? Sometimes patrons brought their entire family along, so your cramped workshop suddenly became a gallery tour. These visits weren't optional. When a man paying you enough to buy a small farm wanted to critique the hand position of St. Peter, you smiled, nodded, and pretended you'd already been thinking of making that change. Of course, with so many people and projects crammed together, the studio became a physical and logistical obstacle course. Wooden scaffolds leaned against walls, pigment dust coated the air, and the smell of drying oil paint lingered like a guest who wouldn't leave. Trip hazards abounded. Jars of turpentine, piles of discarded sketches, and occasionally live animals. Chickens or cats sometimes wandered in, because an open Renaissance door was basically an open invitation, and while the animals added a certain rustic charm, they also had a knack for walking directly across drying canvases. The chaos extended beyond the art itself. Studios doubled as business offices, meaning contracts were negotiated in the same space where apprentices were hammering frames, and someone was coughing on account of inhaling too much ultramarine dust. Masters had to be part artist, part manager, part school teacher, and part debt collector, especially when patrons were late with payments, which was often. Keeping all these moving parts under control required a temperament that could withstand both creative crises and teenage apprentices accidentally spilling a week's worth of painstakingly prepared vermilion. One of the most comical and occasionally infuriating aspects of studio life was the constant juggling of deadlines. Commissions didn't politely line up in a queue, they overlapped. You might be in the middle of a fresco for the local cathedral, when a wealthy merchant demanded a portrait of his wife be finished by next Tuesday, because her sister's coming to town. The result? Artists working on 3 or 4 different projects at once, each at varying stages of completion, while also trying to look composed enough to inspire confidence. And then there was the gossip. With assistants, apprentices, and visitors all moving in and out, studios were hotbeds of rumor. Who was secretly courting whose daughter? Which rival artist had borrowed a composition idea from your last altarpiece? Which patron had stiffed the baker and the goldsmith in the same week? This constant hum of chatter could be both entertaining and distracting, though many a bored apprentice learned more about politics, love affairs, and the ugly side of patronage than they ever did about brushwork in their first year. If the Renaissance studio sounds like a 3-ring circus, that's because it was. But somehow, amid the clamor of hammering, arguing, and the occasional chicken mishap, great works of art were born. The master's hand would add those final perfect touches, transforming the chaos into something divine. And perhaps that's the real miracle of Renaissance art. Not that it's so beautiful centuries later, but that it ever got finished at all. Because truly, running a studio in the Renaissance was less like crafting eternal masterpieces and more like trying to run a bakery during a parade with saints, scaffolds, and the smell of linseed oil replacing the bread. And yet, against all odds, it worked. Sort of. So you've clawed your way up from obscurity, survived the toxic pigments, the flying chisels, and the relentless smell of linseed oil, and finally, the world knows your name. Your paintings hang in the palaces of dukes, your frescoes glare down at popes, and your self-portrait is more recognizable than your local bishop. Congratulations, you're famous. And in the Renaissance, that's both the dream and the nightmare. First, let's talk about the good part. Fame meant commissions, and not the small-time paint my cousin's dowry portrait type. We're talking cathedral ceilings, state-sanctioned monuments, and portraits of the sort of people who had armies at their disposal. The great artists, think Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, didn't just have patrons. They had patrons who could literally have them excommunicated if they didn't deliver on time. Which brings us to the first downside. There was no such thing as politely turning down work. If a duke wanted a fresco of himself looking like Julius Caesar, you painted it. If the Pope wanted you to stop carving your masterpiece and instead drop everything to paint a chapel ceiling, you climbed that scaffolding and got to work. The more famous you got, the more the work piled in. Fame didn't free you to make your personal art, it chained you to a conveyor belt of commissions. And because Renaissance patrons were notoriously picky, they weren't shy about requesting edits. Imagine laboring for months over a saint's expression, only to have a cardinal wander in and say, "Make the eyes sadder." No, sadder than that. Actually, can you make him look like he's thinking about tax reform? You didn't argue, you repainted. Then there were the rivals. Fame in the Renaissance wasn't a cozy artistic brotherhood. It was a blood sport fought with gossip, sabotage, and passive-aggressive altarpieces. Rival workshops would whisper to patrons that your colors faded quickly or that you had an unfortunate tendency to paint noses too wide. Competitors would accidentally place their apprentices in your studio to spy on your techniques, and if you thought intellectual property theft was a modern invention, think again. Compositions were copied shamelessly, with just enough changes to pass as inspired by rather than blatantly stolen. Fame also made you a target for satire. Pamphlets, plays, and snide poems circulated about artists who were more pigment than brains, or who spent more time wooing noble women than finishing their commissions. And because artists depended on the goodwill of wealthy patrons, even a single well-placed insult could cost you a year's worth of work. But perhaps the worst part of Renaissance celebrity was the time management, or complete lack thereof. While a lesser-known painter could spend weeks perfecting a single fold of drapery, you, the famed master, were expected to juggle 5 projects in 5 different cities. Some artists tried to solve this by employing armies of assistants, each trained to paint in their master's style, which meant you didn't have to do every brushstroke yourself, but also meant your name was on work you barely touched. Patrons didn't care, they'd paid for your name, and your name was going on that altarpiece, whether you personally painted the Virgin Mary or not. Travel was another headache. As a Renaissance celebrity, you might be summoned to Venice for a portrait, Florence for a fresco, and Rome for a sculpture, all in the same year. This meant weeks on the road, braving muddy passes, dubious inns, and thieves who'd be happy to lighten your load of gold ducats, and heaven help you if you got sick halfway through a commission. A patron's patience wore thin fast, and letters demanding your return could be sharp enough to cut marble. Of course, the fame tax wasn't just professional, it was personal. As soon as your reputation soared, so did the demands on your time. Everyone wanted favors. Your cousin's son needed an apprenticeship. A distant acquaintance wanted a small portrait at a family discount, and the guild wanted you to judge every annual competition. Privacy was non-existent. Wealthy patrons might drop in unannounced to watch the master at work, which was as enjoyable as having your boss peer over your shoulder for 3 hours straight. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the rivals, the impossible deadlines, and the pressure to please people with more political clout than artistic taste, most Renaissance artists craved fame. It was the currency that could buy them independence, or at least the illusion of it. Fame meant larger commissions, better pay, and the ability to sign your name where lesser artists were forgotten. The great irony? By the time you were truly famous, you were probably too busy painting everyone else's vision to realize your own. The funny thing about Renaissance celebrity is that it didn't end when you died. Your reputation could grow or crumble based on the whims of later generations. Today's great master could become tomorrow's mediocre craftsman, and vice versa. But in life, the moment fame found you, it demanded its price. Twice the work, twice the stress, and a lifetime of painting angels whose noses would never be the right size. In the grand retelling of the Renaissance, it's easy to imagine that every painter, sculptor, and architect waltzed into immortality with pockets full of gold and the adoration of future generations. But the truth is far less glamorous. For every Michelangelo chiseling his name into eternity, there were dozens of equally talented artists whose names have been lost somewhere between a crumbling church wall and the back of a damp archive. And while Renaissance art did indeed change the way people saw the world, the artists themselves often left it feeling underpaid, underappreciated, and very much underfed. Take, for example, the tragic fact that many Renaissance masters died broke and sometimes owing money. Commissions might sound lucrative on paper, but delays, disputes, or patrons suddenly forgetting to pay could turn that dream project into a financial anchor. Contracts were often elaborate and legally binding for the artist. The patron? Well, they might change their mind halfway through the job and demand alterations, or worse, refuse payment because the finished work didn't match the saint's energy they had in mind. It's one thing to disappoint a picky nobleman, but quite another when that nobleman is also your only source of income. Then there's the problem of unfinished works, the silent graveyard of the art world. Wars broke out, plagues swept through cities, patrons died before paying the balance. Or maybe the artist simply lost interest after spending 7 years painting drapery folds for a minor saint in the background. Whatever the reason, half-finished frescoes and incomplete sculptures littered workshops and cathedrals. Some were abandoned entirely, others completed decades later by apprentices who guessed at what the original design might have been. The results could range from passable to "why is that angel glaring like he's about to start a bar fight?" Even for those whose art survived, their legacy was at the mercy of history's famously fickle memory. Renaissance celebrity status did not guarantee permanent recognition. Styles fell out of favor, rival schools of art rose to prominence, and political or religious shifts could reframe an artist's reputation overnight. Imagine being celebrated as a genius in your lifetime, only to have your work dismissed as old-fashioned 20 years later, the Renaissance equivalent of your hit album being relegated to the bargain bin. And yet the few who did make it into the immortal Hall of Fame weren't necessarily the best by objective standards. They were often the ones with the right connections, the shrewdest self-promotion skills, or the luck to have their work survive in good condition. Some names endure because their pieces were preserved in important locations, while others vanished because their fresco happened to be in a chapel that burned down. History isn't always fair. Sometimes it's just practical. There's also the uncomfortable truth that much of the Renaissance's glory was built on back-breaking labor. Grand frescoes required scaffolding work that could leave you with permanent neck pain. Marble blocks had to be hauled for weeks before you could even touch a chisel, and pigments, often toxic, slowly poisoned the very people creating the masterpieces we now admire from behind velvet ropes. That beautiful blue in the Virgin Mary's robe, it may have cost the artist months of wages to acquire the lapis lazuli, and a slow decline in health from breathing in powdered minerals. But here's the twist. Despite the poverty, the incomplete projects, the unfair erasures, these artists, famous and forgotten alike, shaped the visual language of Western civilization. They influenced architecture, inspired revolutions in thought, and gave us works that continue to draw millions of eyes centuries later. They may not all have enjoyed comfortable retirements, but their influence is stitched into the very fabric of culture. Every time a modern painter borrows a compositional trick from Raphael, or a film lights a scene with the chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, that thread of legacy tightens. Still, one can't help but notice the irony. Many of these works were created to glorify patrons, religious institutions, or political regimes that no longer exist in their original form. The dukes and bishops who once preened beside these paintings are now little more than names on a plaque. Meanwhile, the art, and sometimes the artist's name, has outlived them all. The very thing that might have driven an artist to exhaustion and poverty has become their only ticket to historical survival. So congratulations, if you were lucky, your work is in the history books. Unfortunately, you're also probably buried in a pauper's grave, and your great-great-great-grandnephew is selling your unused sketches at the local market for the price of a loaf of bread. The Renaissance, for all its grandeur, had no interest in treating its creators like royalty. The world got its masterpieces, the patrons got their eternal status symbols, and the artists, well, they got remembered sometimes. Because in the end, Renaissance art changed the world, but it didn't always change the lives of the people who made it. And if that sounds unfair, that's because it was. History, as it turns out, has never been a particularly generous employer. Picture this. It's 3,000 years ago. You've just harvested enough grain to feed your family for the winter. Great news. The bad news? It's sitting in a pile at the far end of the field, and you have exactly two transportation options, your spine or your cousin's spine. Life before the wheelbarrow was a tragic love story between humans and heavy loads. Sacks were slung over shoulders, sledges. Essentially, platforms dragged along the ground creaked across dusty roads, wearing grooves into the earth. Sometimes ropes were involved, but those ropes were attached to you, and if you didn't want to risk a hernia, you had to hire more people, or volunteer your less favorite family members for hauling duty. In Egypt, monumental building projects like the pyramids were marvels of engineering and of sheer human stubbornness, without wheels for most hauling tasks. Egyptians relied on long sledges dragged over the sand. Workers would pour water over the sand to reduce friction, which helped unless you were the one doing the dragging, in which case you were now also standing in a mud puddle. Heavy stone blocks were moved using log rollers, but logs wore down fast, and when they broke, someone's foot paid the price. Mesopotamians were brilliant at irrigation and agriculture, but moving their harvest from fields to storage was the ultimate leg day workout. They had carts, big, ox-pulled, two-wheeled beasts, but those were for big jobs and smooth roads. If you were hauling smaller daily loads, you were on your own. Barley sacks, on the shoulder. Clay jars of beer, on the shoulder, and try not to trip, the party will be ruined. The Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, and the Olympics, but not much in the way of back-friendly transport. Builders moved marble blocks with sheer manpower and rope systems. Farmers carried baskets strapped across their shoulders. And when it came to naval supplies, sails, ropes, amphorae of wine, they were carried up and down the docks by long-suffering port workers. This was probably great for maintaining those famously sculpted Greek abs, but terrible for your vertebrae. Before the wheelbarrow, moving 200 pounds meant either finding a donkey or becoming one. There were no ergonomic studies, no chiropractors, no lift with your knees training seminars. Injuries were just part of life. Back strain, pulled muscles, crushed toes, hernias, all common. And if you couldn't work because you'd wrenched your back, you weren't getting paid. Also, there's the little matter of time. Moving large quantities without efficient tools was slow. Farmers lost daylight hauling crops. Builders lost days shifting materials. Armies lost battles because supplies arrived late or exhausted. Efficiency wasn't just a convenience, it could mean survival. The wheel had already been invented by 3500 BCE, but for centuries it was mostly used for big carts pulled by animals. Nobody had thought to give the humble laborer a one-wheeled personal transport buddy. Imagine knowing the wheel exists but you're still dragging firewood across a field like it's the Stone Age. The wheelbarrow's absence left a gap in history. A gap filled with the sound of grunts, curses, and occasional yelps when someone dropped a load on their own foot. Humanity had tools, we had clever ideas, we even had leverage systems, but until someone slapped a single wheel under a box and gave it handles, we were living in the logistical dark ages. And so, before the wheelbarrow rolled onto the scene, every task that involved moving heavy stuff came down to the same equation. Weight of object times distance to destination times number of curse words muttered equals one very sore human. The irony? People were building aqueducts, inventing writing and mapping the stars, but somehow still relying on methods of heavy lifting that wouldn't look out of place in a caveman's diary. Humanity didn't just need the wheelbarrow, we were crying out for it. If there were a Mount Rushmore for human inventions that spared people's backs, the wheelbarrow would be front and center, and it would owe its place to Han Dynasty China, around 200 CE, somewhere between perfecting fine silk and inventing paper. The Chinese quietly birthed a contraption that would change the way humanity moved heavy stuff. Before this, the main options for transporting goods were to pile them onto an animal, onto another human, or onto a plank, and hope your friends didn't fake an injury halfway to the destination. The wheelbarrow was different. It was not just a tool, it was a relief strategy for tired spines everywhere. The earliest Chinese wheelbarrows were brilliant in their simplicity. A single central wheel placed beneath the load so that the weight wasn't crushing the person pushing it. Unlike modern wheelbarrows, which are front-loaded, these designs often positioned the wheel directly in the middle, making the frame look like a cross between a small cart and a minimalist chariot. This clever engineering wasn't just for looks, it shifted the burden from the operator's shoulders to the wheel itself, which meant one person could carry far more than before without feeling like they had signed up for an unpaid gym membership. In effect, the wheel did the heavy lifting, and the human simply guided it. In farming, the impact was immediate. Imagine you're a Han Dynasty farmer with a plot full of millet and wheat. Before the wheelbarrow, harvesting meant endless back-and-forth trips with baskets or sacks, each load light enough to carry but heavy enough to make your knees regret being attached to you. With a wheelbarrow, you could pile on several times the weight and move it in one trip. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a constant battle against your own endurance, it became about efficiency. More crops moved faster meant less time under the blistering sun and more time at home eating dumplings. Construction also saw a revolution. Han-era building projects, whether for homes, markets, or monumental works, demanded moving stones, clay bricks, and lumber. Without the wheelbarrow, this was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. With it, fewer workers could move more materials in less time, and with fewer injuries. If your ancient foreman was smart, he'd assign the strongest workers to push loaded wheelbarrows, while the weaker ones, say someone's cousin who claimed to have a mysterious leg cramp, could focus on loading and unloading. And because the wheelbarrow made it possible to transport awkward or uneven loads, it wasn't limited to neat stacks of bricks. It could haul tools, animal feed, and even the occasional person who had no business trying to lift a stone block in the first place. But perhaps the most fascinating use of the wheelbarrow was in military logistics. The Han Dynasty wasn't just a period of technological advancement, it was also a time of military campaigns, border defense, and the occasional large-scale move of troops and supplies. The wheelbarrow proved to be a soldier's best friend. Armies could transport food, weapons, and tents across rough terrain with fewer animals and less manpower. In some cases, they were even modified for stealth. Historical records describe wooden oxen and gliding horses, wheelbarrow-like devices that allowed supplies to be moved quietly along narrow paths where carts or pack animals couldn't go. It was a logistical superpower, the kind of advantage that didn't just win battles but also kept soldiers from starving before they got there. There was genius in its practicality, but also in its adaptability. The wheelbarrow didn't require rare materials to build, just wood, some metal for the axle, and a wheel that could be crafted from wood and bound with iron for strength. This meant it could be made in rural villages as easily as in urban workshops, spreading its use far and wide. It wasn't just a tool for the elite, it was for anyone who needed to move more than their arms could handle. And because it reduced the physical toll of labor, it indirectly improved the health and productivity of entire communities. Less time nursing injuries meant more time planting, building, or crafting goods. And the cultural significance shouldn't be overlooked. In Chinese society, where communal labor and cooperation were valued, the wheelbarrow fit right in. It became an everyday sight in fields, markets, and workshops, a humble helper that quietly transformed work routines. Over time, it would even inspire further innovations in transport, influencing designs for carts and other wheeled equipment in different regions. Of course, it's worth noting that the wheelbarrow wasn't just a cold utilitarian device, it was a dignity restorer. Before it, Carrying a heavy load often meant hunching, groaning, and sometimes spilling half of what you were carrying before you arrived. The wheelbarrow changed the posture of labor. Instead of shuffling like a beast of burden, you could stride forward, your load balanced and rolling along, as one might say. If chiropractors had existed back then, the wheelbarrow didn't just carry goods, it carried human dignity back from the chiropractor's office before the chiropractor's office even existed. In short, the Chinese wheelbarrow was one of those rare inventions that improved almost every aspect of life without requiring a giant leap in resources or infrastructure. It made farming more productive, construction faster, armies more mobile, and workers healthier. And it did all of this while being so simple that you could repair it with a hammer, some nails, and a bit of rope. It was, quite literally, a wheel of fortune for the Han dynasty, and for humanity as a whole. By the time the wheelbarrow rolled its way into the hands of Chinese armies, it was no longer just a farmer's best friend, it had become a tactical marvel. In an age when wars were decided as much by who could feed their soldiers as by who had the sharpest swords, the wheelbarrow became an unsung weapon. A single soldier could push enough grain, arrows, or medical supplies to keep several men fighting. And unlike a horse or an ox, it didn't complain, bite, or suddenly decide to nap in the middle of the road. The Han dynasty had already experimented with using the wheelbarrow for construction and farming, but the military application was irresistible. Armies needed mobility, and hauling hundreds of pounds of supplies on human backs slowed them to a crawl. The wheelbarrow, with its central wheel design and balanced load, allowed one person to transport what normally took several men. It was in essence the ancient equivalent of upgrading from a rusty bicycle to a delivery truck. Narrow mountain passes, winding forest trails, and cramped village streets were no problem for this one-wheeled wonder. Large carts with two wheels required wider paths and more animal power, which meant they were noisy and easy to spot. Horses could whinny, carts could rattle, but a wheelbarrow, quiet as a whisper. An army could slip through difficult terrain with supplies moving almost invisibly behind them. A logistical ninja move, the wheelbarrow was also easier to hide. If enemy scouts were nearby, a soldier could simply roll it into a ditch or behind a tree and wait. Try doing that with an ox cart. The wheelbarrow's greatest champion in military history was none other than Zhuge Liang, the legendary strategist of the Three Kingdoms period 2220 CE. Known for his cunning as much as his feather fan, Zhuge supposedly developed a variation called the wooden ox. From the outside, it looked like a strange cross between a wheelbarrow and a pushcart, often with the body shaped vaguely like an ox to conceal its purpose. This was more than a novelty. It was a psychological trick. In enemy eyes, a column of oxen might look like simple farm transport rather than a supply convoy, lowering the chances of attack. The wooden ox could be handled by one person and was perfectly balanced, allowing it to glide over uneven ground without tipping. According to historical records, Zhuge Liang's troops could move large amounts of food and equipment much faster than traditional caravans. This speed gave them a massive advantage. It meant they could outlast enemies in drawn-out campaigns, where hunger was often deadlier than swords. After all, even the most fearsome warrior turns into a grumpy liability if you take away his rice. And it wasn't just supplies. Injured soldiers could be whisked away from the battlefield on wheelbarrows, saving time and lives. In an era before proper stretchers or ambulances, this was revolutionary. A wounded soldier didn't have to hobble back or be carried by two other men. Instead, a comrade could trundle him away with minimal effort. Admittedly, the ride was bumpy, and no one pretended it was comfortable, but it beat bleeding out in the mud. The efficiency of the wheelbarrow in war created ripple effects. Armies could be lighter, faster, and less dependent on expensive animals. In prolonged conflicts, this meant the difference between victory and humiliating retreat. Military manuals from later Chinese dynasties even included notes on wheelbarrow construction and handling, which, if you think about it, puts it in the same category as siege engines and crossbows. The humble one-wheeler had officially earned its place in the pantheon of military hardware. There's a certain irony in imagining battle-hardened generals debating the merits of a wheelbarrow. The warhorse gets all the glory in paintings, but the wheelbarrow was the quiet, creaky hero in the background, carrying the bread, arrows, and sometimes the warriors themselves. Sure, you could march an army with horses, or just push all your stuff on one glorified shopping cart. One was expensive and unpredictable, the other ran on human grit and a splash of elbow grease. The military wheelbarrow was so effective that its use spread beyond China's borders, influencing neighboring regions. In Japan and Southeast Asia, similar designs began to appear, proving that good ideas have a way of traveling, especially if they roll. But at this stage in history, the Chinese battlefield wheelbarrow stood unmatched in both ingenuity and impact. It didn't just carry the war effort, in many ways it carried the war itself. Next, we could roll smoothly into how the wheelbarrow eventually left the battlefield behind and found a new life in agriculture and construction across different cultures, showing that sometimes the greatest peacetime tools are born from war. For a tool so simple in concept, the wheelbarrow's trip to Europe took its sweet time, centuries in fact. This wasn't some viral gadget that made its way around the globe in a week. No. The wheelbarrow travelled at the pace of a diplomatic envoy with a fondness for sightseeing and long lunches. The origins lay firmly in China's Han Dynasty brilliance, but by the time European eyes first saw one, it was already an old idea with a fresh passport stamp. The route it took wasn't a straight line either. Like most useful inventions in the medieval world, the wheelbarrow was less courier express and more random detours via several wars, an argument over tariffs, and at least one camel caravan that got lost. The Silk Road played the quiet but crucial role of matchmaker here. Traders moving between east and west weren't just hauling silk, spices and porcelain, they were carrying ideas. A farmer in Persia might see a merchant pushing something that made moving grain much easier and think, "Huh, that's clever," before sketching it from memory. A craftsman in the Byzantine Empire might hear about a device that could cut labor in half and start experimenting. And so the wheelbarrow's design hopped between cultures, sometimes changing shape in the process. It was the ultimate hand-me-down technology, except instead of a cousin giving you an old coat, it was a dynasty unknowingly giving you a back-saving transportation method. When the wheelbarrow finally made its grand European debut sometime in the 12th century, it wasn't accompanied by a parade or a declaration that this would revolutionize work forever. In fact, early references to it are surprisingly casual, as if medieval chroniclers didn't quite know how big a deal it would be. The earliest depictions show up in manuscripts and church carvings, tucked between illustrations of saints and farm laborers. One day a scribe is writing about biblical parables, the next he's drawing a man pushing a pile of rocks on a single wheel. That's how history sometimes works. Monumental inventions sneak in under the radar like uninvited but oddly useful guests. Interestingly, Europeans didn't copy the Chinese blueprint exactly. In China, the wheel was usually placed directly under the load, allowing most of the weight to be balanced on it. This meant less strain on the person pushing it, an elegant marriage of design and ergonomics. But Europeans, ever keen to make things a little harder on themselves, often put the wheel at the very front, more like a small cart. This design meant you had to lift and balance the load yourself, essentially making the wheelbarrow a cooperative effort between you and gravity, with gravity always trying to ruin your day. Why the change? Possibly because Europeans were already used to two-wheeled carts and simply adapted that design down to one. Or maybe they just hadn't seen enough of the Chinese model to realize there was a better way. Still, even the European version was a leap forward compared to carrying everything on your back or dragging it on a sled. Farmers used it for hauling manure, stones, and harvested crops. Builders employed it to move timber and mortar. And somewhere, inevitably, a mischievous teenager realized you could also use it to push your friend downhill at unsafe speeds. The wheelbarrow, in other words, found its niche. Its adoption across Europe wasn't uniform, though. Some regions embraced it immediately, while others seemed hesitant, as if suspicious of anything that could make work easier. In certain monastic communities, where manual labor was considered a form of spiritual discipline, the wheelbarrow may have been viewed as a little too convenient. After all, how can you atone for your sins if you're not sweating under the crushing weight of a full sack of grain? But in bustling medieval towns, where time was money and labor shortages were common, the wheelbarrow was an instant win. Masons, carpenters, and dock workers quickly realized this humble invention could shave hours off a day's work, leaving them more time for drinking ale and complaining about taxes. The cultural exchange that brought the wheelbarrow west wasn't just about the tool itself. It was part of a broader medieval trend. The same trade routes that carried it also brought papermaking from China, algebra from the Islamic world, and navigational knowledge from the Indian Ocean. The wheelbarrow was just one piece of the vast puzzle of knowledge migration, a quiet example of how global connections shaped local lives long before the term globalization existed. Of course, medieval Europe being medieval Europe, there was no shortage of arguments about how to actually build one. The design varied from region to region, with differences in wheel size, frame shape, and whether the handles should be straight or slightly angled. In some places they used solid wooden wheels, in others they went for spoke designs. It was, in essence, a medieval version of IKEA, except there were no printed instructions, no helpful hex key, and you had to cut your own parts from whatever timber was lying around. Disagreements were inevitable. One craftsman might swear by a high, narrow frame for better maneuverability, while his neighbor argued for a wide, low build to prevent tipping. Both thought the other was an idiot, and both would probably have been right in certain situations. By the end of the medieval period, the wheelbarrow had embedded itself into European daily life, becoming so commonplace that it no longer seemed exotic, yet it's worth remembering that its arrival was anything but ordinary. It had crossed continents, shifted designs, and survived cultural indifference to become one of the quiet workhorses of history. Without it, Europe's cathedrals might have taken longer to build, its fields longer to harvest, and its builders longer to recover from slipped discs. And so, while it didn't arrive in a blaze of glory, the wheelbarrow rolled into Europe with the same quiet persistence it would one day show on countless farms and work sites, a tool that asked for no credit but gave back hours of labor saved. If you were a mason in the High Middle Ages, your job description was simple: lift, carry, stack, repeat, until the church reached the heavens or your spine gave out, whichever came first. Then came the wheelbarrow, a contraption so deceptively basic that it turned centuries of construction labor on its head. And in the Gothic cathedral boom of the 12th to 16th centuries, it became the silent partner in Europe's most ambitious building spree. Before the wheelbarrow, hauling heavy loads on a building site was a grim game of human relay. Workers used sledges, essentially flat planks dragged across the ground, or slings and stretchers carried by teams. This was slow, exhausting, and about as ergonomic as wrestling a sack of stones. The wheelbarrow, with its single wheel and load-bearing tray, introduced something revolutionary. One person could move as much as 2 or 3 could before, and they could do it without needing a chiropractor on standby. Gothic cathedrals were no small undertaking. These were colossal, multi-decade projects that demanded a constant flow of stone, timber, and mortar. In a single day, hundreds of masons, carpenters, and laborers would swarm a site like industrious ants, all feeding the towering structure inch by inch. Wheelbarrows became the arteries of this hive, shuttling loads from ground-level storage to scaffolding ramps and elevated platforms. The beauty of the wheelbarrow lay not just in its carrying capacity, but in its adaptability. On a cathedral site, it could ferry finely carved stone blocks one moment and steaming lime mortar the next. Its wheel, when well maintained, could trundle across the hard-packed earth of the workyard, or be nudged up planks acting as ramps. This versatility meant it was just as useful in the mud as it was in the nave, and unlike carts, which required a flat, wide path and often a team of animals, the wheelbarrow was narrow enough to snake through scaffolding and nimble enough to turn on a dime, a medieval forklift without the gas bill. There was also a certain unspoken respect for the men who pushed them. Wheelbarrow handlers weren't just strong, They had balance, coordination, and the mental fortitude to navigate a wobbly plank walkway 3 stories up while holding 200 pounds of stone. A single misstep meant either a cracked block or a very bad day for anyone standing below. If masons were the artists of the cathedral, wheelbarrow men were the lifeline keeping the project moving. Literally, the impact on construction timelines was enormous. Cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, and Notre Dame didn't just rise because architects dreamed big. They rose because wheelbarrows kept a steady supply of material flowing without exhausting the workforce prematurely. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. In a time when a project could span several generations, shaving months or years off the build time mattered. It reduced costs, improved efficiency, and made the impossible slightly more possible. Of course, the wheelbarrow's arrival didn't eliminate all the hazards. Medieval construction sites were dangerous places. Falling debris, collapsing scaffolds, and the occasional misjudged ramp meant injury was never far away. Wheelbarrows themselves could turn into instruments of chaos if a load shifted suddenly, or if the operator lost control on a downhill slope. Imagine watching 200 pounds of limestone careening toward the master builder's tent. Medieval slapstick at its most unintentional. From a broader perspective, the wheelbarrow helped democratize labor. With it, tasks that once required a team of muscular men could be managed by a single worker. This not only freed up manpower for other jobs, but also allowed smaller framed individuals, including younger apprentices, to contribute more substantially. In a sense, the wheelbarrow was an equalizer, enabling more people to play a part in Europe's great architectural ventures. And let's be honest, every flying buttress in Europe owes its existence to some sweaty, determined labourer grunting their way across a muddy yard with a load of stone in a rickety wheelbarrow. Those ornate stained glass windows? They didn't float up there by divine intervention. The wheelbarrow was the unsung, unglamorous sidekick of the Gothic age, quietly saving countless backs while making the dreams of bishops and master masons a reality. In the story of cathedral building, architects may have gotten the glory, masons the artistic credit, and patrons the eternal bragging rights. But without the wheelbarrow, many of these stone giants might still be half-finished skeletons on Europe's skyline. Sometimes, history's greatest monuments don't just stand on faith and ambition, they stand on one wheel, a wooden tray, and a lot of sweat. If the Gothic cathedrals were the highbrow career move for the wheelbarrow, farming was its bread and butter gig. Literally, because without farms there's no bread, butter, or anything else worth pushing around. Long before tractors, combine harvesters, or pickup trucks, the wheelbarrow was the farmer's best friend, and unlike actual friends, it didn't drink all your ale or complain about the smell of manure. In China, the wheelbarrow was already a well-established tool for hauling heavy loads over long distances, so it was only natural for it to make the leap from transporting siege equipment to carrying cabbages. By the Tang dynasty, Chinese farmers were loading theirs with sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, and inevitably piles of animal droppings. In Europe, once the wheelbarrow rolled in during the medieval period, it was quickly put to work on the land. For peasants, the upgrade from dragging sacks over their shoulders to wheeling them was life-changing. For their spines, it was a minor miracle. In the days when planting required endless trips back and forth with baskets or buckets, the wheelbarrow suddenly offered a way to carry more seeds, seedlings, or saplings in one go. It might not sound like much now, but shaving hours off the back-and-forth routine meant more fields could be planted before weather or wildlife had their say. In China, this was especially important for rice cultivation, where the timing of transplanting seedlings could make or break the harvest. A wheelbarrow full of delicate green shoots meant fewer trips, less bending, and more time to prepare the paddies. Harvest time is a race against nature. Grain needs to be cut, bundled, dried, and stored before rain or rot sets in. Without wheelbarrows, medieval harvesters often had to carry their loads by hand in baskets or on carts that required animals to pull them. Animals that, inconveniently, were also busy working the fields. A single person with a wheelbarrow could move bushels of grain or crates of vegetables without tying up a valuable ox. In vineyards, wheelbarrows ferried grapes from the field to the wine press, reducing the time between picking and pressing, which in turn improved the quality of the wine. Medieval wine wasn't always great, but this was at least a step in the right direction. We can't talk about agriculture without talking about fertilizer, and in pre-industrial times, that meant manure. Lots and lots of manure. Without the wheelbarrow, moving the stuff from barn to field was slow, back-breaking work. With the wheelbarrow, one person could move in a single trip what might otherwise take 2 or 3. This meant fields could be fertilized more efficiently, boosting yields. Farmers might not have enjoyed the smell, but they enjoyed eating through the winter far more. A peasant pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with manure may not be the romantic image we associate with history, but it's the unglamorous truth. A steady supply of animal waste, properly spread, could make the difference between abundance and famine. And the wheelbarrow was the delivery system. Small farmers benefited most from the wheelbarrow's efficiency. On a small holding, every able-bodied worker counted, and the ability for one person to move more goods meant others could focus on planting, tending, or herding. On large estates, wheelbarrows multiplied the productivity of the labor force, especially during peak agricultural seasons. In both cases, the wheelbarrow reduced the number of people needed for sheer grunt work, freeing them for more skilled tasks. Beyond the fields, wheelbarrows played a quiet role in rural trade. Farmers could load up surplus produce and wheel it into market towns, avoiding the expense of hiring animal transport for small loads. In China, where many rural communities were linked by narrow footpaths unsuited for carts, the wheelbarrow allowed direct trade between villages. In Europe, it gave poorer farmers a way to bring goods to market without relying on middlemen, which often meant keeping a greater share of the profit. Agriculture is seasonal, but the wheelbarrow never sat idle for long. In spring, it carried manure to the fields. In summer, it ferried crops to storage. In autumn, it hauled firewood and fodder for livestock. In winter, it shifted stones, soil, or compost in preparation for the next year. It was a year-round workhorse, and unlike actual horses, it didn't need feeding, grooming, or the occasional expensive shoe replacement. A wheelbarrow full of manure may not smell like progress, but it was. Every heap of fertilizer dumped in the right place was a promise of future food. The wheelbarrow didn't just make farming easier, it made it more productive and sustainable. It gave farmers a tool that amplified human strength, made better use of limited time, and helped feed growing populations. If the wheelbarrow were a person, this would be the part where it shrugs and says, "I'm just doing my job," before trundling off with another load of cabbage and cow dung. It never got statues or songs written in its honor, but it probably fed more people than many kings ever did. And that, in the end, is real power. It's easy to think of the wheelbarrow as one of those perfect, immutable inventions like the spoon or the brick that got it right the first time and never needed much tinkering. But humanity is incapable of leaving anything alone. Give us a perfectly functional tool, and we will spend centuries sanding, hammering, and occasionally ruining it in the name of innovation. The wheelbarrow was no exception. By the late Middle Ages, the basic design had proved itself in fields, construction sites, and battlefields alike. A single wheel, a load bed, and 2 handles. That's all you needed. But people noticed the flaws too. Wooden trays rotted in the rain. Handles wore smooth and slippery with sweat. The wheel itself could jam in mud or splinter apart. And so began the long history of upgrades, tweaks, and what if we put this on it? That continues to this day. One of the earliest major upgrades was swapping out the traditional all-wood build for a metal tray. This didn't happen overnight. It required affordable iron and later steel manufacturing. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, you could buy a wheelbarrow with a sturdy metal bed that wouldn't warp or decay after a wet season. Metal trays also meant you could carry more dangerous or abrasive loads like hot coal, gravel, or broken stone, without turning your wheelbarrow into splinters on legs. Yes, it was heavier, but if you were hauling rocks all day, you weren't exactly looking for a cardio-light workout anyway. Around the same time, the handles got a rethink. Earlier wheelbarrows often had a single central beam-style handle which required you to grip from the sides, not exactly ergonomic. The dual-handle design, now so common it seems obvious, allowed for better balance, more control, and less wrist strain. Farmers and builders didn't call it ergonomics back then, they just called it not dropping the load on your foot. The wheel itself also saw dramatic change. For centuries, a solid wooden wheel, sometimes banded with iron, was the standard, but solid wheels made for a bumpy ride and could get hopelessly stuck in wet or loose soil. Enter the pneumatic tire, a spoked wheel with an air-filled rubber tube that transformed the wheelbarrow from a rattling bone shaker to a surprisingly smooth operator. Pneumatic tires absorbed shocks, rolled more easily over uneven terrain, and didn't sink as quickly into soft ground. Of course, they also introduced the age-old curse of the flat tire, meaning that many a farmer has muttered darkly while wrestling a stubborn inner tube in the rain. Then came specialization. By the Industrial Revolution, the wheelbarrow had already spread into every type of labor imaginable, but each industry wanted its own version. Miners had rugged, low-profile wheelbarrows with reinforced frames to survive the abuse of underground rock transport. Gardeners got lighter models with shallower trays for soil and seedlings, easy to maneuver between flower beds. Concrete workers developed massive deep tray wheelbarrows to move heavy wet cement in bulk, usually with a thicker frame and reinforced legs to prevent collapse. There were even tipping wheelbarrows with trays that could pivot forward like a dump truck to unload their cargo, without the operator having to flip the entire thing over. By the 20th century, the wheelbarrow had infiltrated the suburban backyard. Plastic trays, lighter, rust-proof, and often brightly colored, arrived on the scene, perfect for moving mulch, leaves, or the occasional load of firewood without the risk of rust or rot. While purists scoffed, "If it's not steel, it's not real," many home gardeners happily traded a bit of durability for the ease of pushing something that didn't weigh as much as its load before you even filled it. Some innovators took things further, adding motor assistance. Yes, motorized wheelbarrows exist, and no, they aren't cheating. These gas or battery-powered brutes are essentially miniature dump trucks with a single front wheel and tracks or powered wheels at the back. They can carry hundreds of pounds uphill without breaking a sweat, though they tend to cost as much as a decent second-hand car. For the average person, they're overkill. For the professional landscaper or builder, they're a dream come true. And then there are the eccentric designs. Foldable wheelbarrows, designed to collapse for easy storage, have made their way into cramped urban gardens. Two-wheel models offer extra stability, useful for people who'd rather avoid the balancing act of a single wheel. Even all-terrain wheelbarrows exist, with oversized balloon tires for use on beaches, muddy fields, or you guessed it, music festivals where hauling gear through the mud becomes an Olympic sport. The funny thing is, for all these improvements, the basic principle hasn't changed in over 1,000 years. A wheel, a platform, and a way to push it. That's all you need. You can gold-plate it, motorize it, or make it collapsible. But the humble wheelbarrow remains at heart the same tool it was when the first farmer or builder thought, "What if I didn't have to carry this on my back?" From wood to steel to plastic, from unshod wheels to cushy pneumatic tires, the wheelbarrow's evolution is proof of one of humanity's defining traits. We'll never stop tinkering with something that works perfectly well, because deep down, we believe it could always work just a little bit better, and maybe, just maybe, one day we'll invent the final, ultimate wheelbarrow, right before someone else says, "You know, I think we can improve this." The wheelbarrow has rolled into the 21st century, with all the stubborn persistence of a grandparent refusing to upgrade from a flip phone. Sure, the world has smartphones, drones, and robot dogs, but there's still a man in a fluorescent vest pushing a wheelbarrow full of gravel down the street. Some tools are so perfect in their simplicity that technology can only politely nod and say, "We'll call you if we need you." In modern construction, the wheelbarrow hasn't been replaced. It's just been upgraded with better materials. Contractors still swear by it for jobs where big machinery can't fit, or where it's simply overkill to rent a backhoe just to move 12 bricks. Landscapers, meanwhile, treat the wheelbarrow like a loyal co-worker. It hauls soil, mulch, potted plants, and the occasional lunch cooler. People love it too. For home projects, it's the Goldilocks of transport. Not too big, not too small, just right for lugging that pile of decorative stones you swore wouldn't be that heavy when you bought them. And unlike powered equipment, a wheelbarrow won't stall, guzzle gas, or need a firmware update. The only maintenance it usually demands is a little oil on the wheel and an occasional hose down after carrying suspiciously smelly loads outside construction sites and gardens. The wheelbarrow has taken on a surprisingly festive second life. Across other countries, wheelbarrow races have become annual village fair highlights. In these events, participants either race while pushing a friend in a wheelbarrow or both dress in ridiculous costumes for added spectacle. The rules vary, but the constant is that someone somewhere inevitably tips over in dramatic slow motion. Then there's the wheelbarrow parade. Yes, that's a thing. In some communities, people decorate their wheelbarrows with flowers, streamers, or even fairy lights for seasonal processions. And in an odd twist, artists have been known to turn wheelbarrows into sculptures, filling them with everything from neon lights to taxidermy animals, because nothing says deep social commentary like a fox in a wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow has picked up symbolic weight over the centuries. In literature and art, it's been used to represent humble labor, self-reliance, and the dignity of physical work. But it's also been a stand-in for stubborn perseverance. The idea that you can carry a heavy load one step at a time and eventually get where you're going. In political satire, the wheelbarrow has even been used as a prop to poke fun at economic collapse. Think of those infamous images from Weimar Germany of people wheeling barrows full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. It's the same simple cart, just with a wildly different kind of payload. In an age where even your toaster wants to connect to Wi-Fi, it's no surprise that engineers have been tinkering with robotic wheelbarrows. These range from motorized models that assist the user's push to fully autonomous versions that follow workers around like obedient pets, hauling tools and materials without complaint. One example is the powered wheelbarrow, essentially a small electric cart with the familiar tray and wheel design, but with a battery-powered drive system. It's a godsend for landscapers working on hilly terrain or elderly gardeners who still want to do heavy work without throwing out their backs. The fully robotic versions are still in their experimental phase, often featuring sensors to navigate obstacles and GPS to follow pre-programmed routes. The idea is that you could load it up, tap a button, and have it meet you on the other side of the site. In theory, it sounds brilliant. In practice, one can only imagine the chaos when a rogue wheelbarrow goes on a slow-motion rampage across a parking lot. While automation is creeping in, the odds of the traditional wheelbarrow disappearing are slim. It's too cheap, too easy to repair, and too versatile to replace entirely. If anything, we're likely to see hybrid designs, part human-powered, part electric, tailored for specific industries. For example, collapsible wheelbarrows for urban gardeners who don't have storage space. Lightweight plastic trays reinforced with composite materials for durability without extra weight. Modular attachments so you can swap between a flatbed, a tray, and even a water tank. And yes, there's always the chance that someone will make a self-driving wheelbarrow with an app that lets you order it like a food delivery robot. Whether that's progress or just proof that humans can't leave well enough alone, that's up for debate. 2,000 years ago, someone figured out that sticking a wheel under a load saved a lot of groaning and swearing. That principle hasn't changed. The wheelbarrow remains one of the few tools that crosses the divide between ancient ingenuity and modern necessity without needing a reinvention every 5 years. It's proof that sometimes the best technology is the simplest, unless of course you slap a motor in it, give it a GPS chip, and let it roam free. Then it's just progress, with a front row seat to the inevitable blooper reel.